All right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today we are continuing on with another Shroud solo lecture from me. But this is going to be based on fan requests. So I recently received two fan requests to do this show and to get my response on. So the first is going to be on the breaking news proving the Shroud is authentic on the WAXS method that was published by Dr. Giulio Fanti and others in the journal Heritage, based on the X-ray dating of the Shroud of Turin. And I received a request from the BSTS to make an announcement and kind of can talk about it for publicity's sake. But beyond that, I also wanted to provide more of an in-depth kind of take on it as well, rather than just going over the popular headlines and stuff like that, because I've done shows on it. So I'll get into that. The second topic is, again, related to Hugh's hypocritical hit piece. Now, like I said in the last show, look, I've said my piece. I exposed what I think are the flaws in Hugh. I gave him an opportunity to repent and for reconciliation, which I think is fair, which allows him to keep up his blog as is and just put a disclaimer that he doesn't think I'm a purposeful liar or anything like that. Beyond that, great. He wants to say I'm wrong about this or that. That's fine. That's what the debate's about. Hugh has chosen not to do that, and that's a shame. That means my Shroud Wars, I love bringing Shroud skeptics and both sides together. I'm not sure now about the future of that. But I'll talk about that in the second half when we get to basically a fan asked me about something to do with the carbon-14 dating. One of Hugh's attacks was related to some quotes that I gave about the reliability of the AMS carbon-14 dating for testing or for dating the Shroud of Turin back in 1988 as a linen textile. And various intercomparison studies proved it wasn't really a reliable method in that respect in terms of being able to date the Shroud at that time. So I'm going to go over that in the second half of this episode. But for the first part, let's get excited because, my gosh, if you've been hiding under a rock and you have no clue what's been going on, the Shroud has been proven to be authentic in the minds of the popular layperson. Again, the Shroud is now popular. It's cool to believe the Shroud is authentic again because of the X-ray dating proving it dates to the 1st century.
Breaking news, folks, that there's brand new evidence that proves the Shroud of Turin. We can all pack it up. Our entire series that we just recorded, the last one like a few days ago. Complete waste of time because new evidence that just dropped shows we're wrong.
Just want to show people the article. Let me bring that up. Boom. From the Daily Mail. Is this proof the Turin Shroud is real? Scientists make a startling discovery after analyzing the cloth Jesus was buried in. Scientists claim the Turin Shroud can be dated back to the time of Jesus' life. So this is what's kind of sparked it all here. And from that, there has literally been a flurry, especially in the UK, a tsunami, you might even say. Since Tuesday, August 20th, when this article was posted, there's a flurry of positive coverage about the Shroud of Turin because of this article written by the journalist Stacey Libator from the Daily Mail. And this article has subsequently been re-edited, released now on all UK tabloid platforms, new articles, and it's spreading to here in Canada and the US, which is awesome to hear. Obviously, many Shroud enthusiasts have commented that as a result of this incredible news coverage, there may be many people out there looking for information for the Shroud of Turin, and specifically this WAXS method. And that's why I'm doing this show today. Part of it was, as I said, a fan request. So I got a great request from someone from Brenda and Stuart Benton at BSTS to help market this discovery, and more than that, to help lay people go beyond just the tabloid headlines and to get the actual details on this remarkable finding to figure out what's true or not. So on that front, I want to recommend the British Shroud of Turin BSTS newsletter. And the editor of the magazine is Michael Kowalski. He's a personal friend of mine. And I just want to show, let me bring that back up. So you can get great information from the BSTS newsletter, just becoming a member. I think it's something like £10 a year or something. Yep, £10 per year. So it's virtually free. And trust me, BSTS has treated me well. I'm an honorary member, and man, the information in here is amazingly in depth from the experts themselves. This summer, the latest summer edition was incredible, and I've read through this, including articles from the first timer, Teddy Pappas, her article on rigor mortis, Jack Markworth's article refuting the Shroud skeptic Hugh Farey and his nonsense about the medieval history of the Shroud. Jack really gets into the details there, as well as a host of other great articles and stuff like that. So on this WAXS method, BSTS has a great amount of information for you. And also check out on their Facebook page various updates, which includes about this WAXS method. So you can see on facebook.com, BSTS news. So yeah, that's what I just wanted to, in terms of the marketing, if you want to get great information on the Shroud. Look, this isn't, even though it's news, sometimes it takes the pop culture a bit of time to recognize things. But this is actually a discovery that was made, this was published back in 2022, for example, a full 2 years ago. And this is stuff that has both Jordan and I have covered in depth on our own shows. In fact, you'll see this flurry from, Cameron Bertuzzi on Capturing Christianity, a whole host of podcasters talking about it, including I was on the Reason in Theology podcast with Louis Dizon and Michael Lofton. So Michael Lofton has just posted up about this discovery as being brand new as well. But funnily enough, he didn't know I actually covered it, about a year ago, 10 months ago, when I was on his show. So let me just play that little clip so you can see that, yep, this isn't something that has been around. It has been known by Shroud scholars or people who are looking in depth into it, but it just hasn't made it into the pop culture until now. Again, that's great. It takes time, but let me just play that clip just to prove that, yep, I did talk about it.
Remember, that's the international statistical standard that you have to get. If you're less than 95, like with the carbon dating, it's garbage. You can't trust it. If you have the 95 or more degree of confidence, you're good to go. And here's just kind of an illustration of how the dating methods look. So you have the carbon-14 as an outlier all the way out here. You have Giulio Fanti's statistical argument with the coins that places it to 692 or earlier. And then you have his 3 dating methods. And guess what? The only period that they overlap in is the 1st century AD, the time of Jesus. And then here's an example of the peer-reviewed paper on the X-ray dating.
As you can see, I did mention this, and I mentioned this much earlier than 10 years ago, than 10 months ago as well on my own show. And I'm going to be playing clips from that, from the experts, to get into this in detail based on all the shows I've done on this, both pro and con. Okay, so with that said, let me start by having one of the experts from the peer-reviewed paper itself, Giulio Fanti, who's a friend of mine and the leader of the prestigious and exclusive Shroud Science Group. He was one of the scientists that took part in this X-ray dating of the Shroud and making this remarkable finding. And it's important to note that alongside the X-ray dating, there are 3 other physical scientific dating tests, 3 others, so a total of 4 physical dating tests that Giulio Fanti has been involved in and published in peer-reviewed papers for at least some of the other tests, like the mechanical dating test, for example, and has spoken about and published papers on for the other methods. So these include a Fourier transform infrared dating technique, Raman spectroscopy, and a mechanical tensile strength test. All of these other tests, along with this newest X-ray dating test, place the Shroud to the 1st century. So let me have Giulio Fanti explain what these tests are in his own words from the actual expert.
In addition, I have performed here in Italy with the help.
So just for context, this isn't about the X-ray. He's starting with his earlier 3 physical dating tests that he talked about back in 2015. So this is before the X-ray. He's explaining these tests. Then we're going to finish off with the newest X-ray dating, which is what all the hoopla is about. So here's Giulio Fanti himself explaining.
Our other colleagues of other universities, 3 alternative datings. Raman analysis, FTIR analysis, and multiparametric mechanical analysis that dated the Shroud to the 1st century after AD, with an uncertainty of more than 200 years, but other analyses have restricted this interval. The multiparametric mechanical analysis was performed by a new machine that we designed and used at zero cost at Padua University, that consisted in mounting the single fibers of linen that are thinner than hair, human hair, and were mounted in a support that was put in this machine, and it was mechanically analyzed up to the breaking and that was detected also the breaking strand of the fiber. The other 2 methods based on IR laser analysis and Raman analysis that are we see here. This is the Raman machine that performed the Raman analysis, and this is the machine relative to IR Fourier transform analysis. To simplify things, we can say that a piece of fabric was put in these machines, and 2 spectra relative to the Raman and IR analysis came out, and the peaks of these spectra compared with other comparison samples performed allowed to detect the year, the age of the Shroud. To do this, we have to build a new method, 3 new methods, and the following procedure was necessary: to find some tens of ancient samples starting from Egyptian mummy, to determine their chemical and mechanical parameter, to determine the corresponding calibration curves, to measure the parameters of the Shroud, and to determine the corresponding date. Some fibers from the Shroud were taken from the filters that collected the fibers vacuumed from the Shroud, and these fibers were recognized by using a spectroscopic microscope who show this particular coral serpent color that it is very typical of the shroud. Then these fibers were mounted in this support, put in this system, in this analytical balance, moved by some levers in a proper system, let's say so. This is the fiber mounted in this support, put in this machine. This is the fibers glued between this part and this part. This strip was designed in this way in order to be so stiff to be moved during the mounting. And then it was burned in these two bridges in order to have the connection between the upper part and the lower part only through this fiber shown here. This is another configuration of the system, and this was an example of the calibration curves detected. Here are the points relative, in this case, to the mechanical loss factor, detected by means of known samples, comparison samples, and this is the results of the Turing Shroud that reports these results. This is the summary of the result, and these are the mechanical parameters. Not all were good. For example, this was quite doubtful, but this is the synthetic results that evidenced the possible age of the shroud detected through FTIR analysis, Raman analysis, and mechanical parameter analysis. It is interesting that only the first century is compatible between among the three methods, and the numismatic analysis confirms that this result. Instead, it is not compatible, obviously, with the 1988 C-14 result. Our results is 33 before Christ plus minus 250 years at 95 confidence level. I have to add that very recently a new study has been published entitled X-ray dating of it.
So this is the new study that everyone's freaking out over right now, this X-ray dating of the shroud. So let's hear Giulio Fanti, one of the scientists, right here. Here he is. Here's his name, Giulio Fanti. That's who's speaking right now. Have him explain his own study and paper here.
Of a Turing Shroud linen sample, published by the scientific journal Heritage. And in synthesis, the X-ray dating produced this plot relative to a piece of the shroud, single thread of the shroud, a few millimeters long, that showed that its degree of the polymerization degree of the cellulose dates the Holy Shroud to the 1st century AD. This is a new confirmation of our previous studies. So we can be quite sure that from a scientific point of view, the shroud is of the 1st century AD, because we have at least 4 scientific methods that confirms this result.
Awesome. Yeah. So, and just to clarify for the audience, as you can see what we have on the screen, this X-ray dating, this was just published, and it dated the Shroud of the 1st century. And it was published in a secular peer-reviewed science journal there. So that's what Giulio Fanti is saying. So there's a total of 4 scientific tests that together collectively demonstrate the Shroud dates to the 1st century is what his case was. Awesome. So I want to turn it to you. Okay, so that is from Giulio Fanti in his own words. Again, I know it's hard to understand because he speaks Italian. He's not a native English speaker, so I did put on the closed captionings to kind of help you there. But you can see from his slides what he's talking about. And as well, if you want more data, just go to my blog at Real Seeker Ministries, plural.wordpress.com. And in the search bar, type in WAXS. And so here's the show I did with Reason and Theology. I just mentioned that. But here's the show I was just showing you with Giulio Fanti, Robert Siefker, and Bob Rucker. And if you click on this blog, I have all of Giulio's papers, including the two peer-reviewed papers on the X-ray dating, because there's not just one, there's 2. So let me bring that up if you want more detailed knowledge. Why is this? There we go. So it's called Shroud Wars, New Evidence on the Dating and Forming the Shroud's Images. Giulio Fanti, Robert Siefker, and Bob Rucker. And here's all the sources, Bob Rucker's sources. If you scroll down to Giulio Fanti's sources, here's section D on Giulio Fanti's sources, and he's got a bunch of papers here. Here's his paper on the 3 physical dating tests from 2015. And I'll just pop that up. So this includes the FTIR, Fourier Transform Infrared Spectroscopy dating technique, the Raman spectroscopy dating technique, and the mechanical strength test that he was talking about. He called it he had some scientific term for it, the multi-parameter mechanical method or something like that, again, by Giulio Fanti. And here's his paper describing those techniques. But in terms of the new X-ray dating, the one that everyone's all hepped up about, 2 peer-reviewed papers in the science journal Heritage. So here's the first one. It's called X-ray Dating, Proving the Shroud Dates to the 1st Century, called X-ray Dating of a Turin Shroud's Limon Sample. And this was, here we go, published, I think this in 2022. So this is part 1. This is the name of it, and you can go over it and read for yourselves about that. But more importantly, if you keep scrolling down to the bottom of my blog here, I include additional sources. So I include the 2nd peer-reviewed paper from Fanti, new paper, Shroud 1st Century by Giulio Fanti and others, based on, it's called the Long-Term Temperature Effects, the Natural Linen Age of the Turin Shroud. So this was also published in the journal Information. And this is part 2 to the WAXS study. So make sure to read both papers. And I was grateful that the Shroud skeptic Jordan from Reason to Doubt, unlike all the others, Cameron Bertuzzi, all these other guys who this is all new for, at least Jordan's aware that there's 2 papers, and it looks like he read both papers. So make sure that you're doing that. Also, look at Hugh Farey. Hugh Farey's not my favorite person, but nonetheless, regardless of what I think wrongs he's done to me personally, he is the most knowledgeable, ultimate Shroud skeptic. And if you're going to have an informed opinion, you have to take into account Hugh's side of things. And so I've included Hugh's blogs, both blogs on the X-ray dating. It's called Waxing and Waning. So part 1 is here, Waxing and Waning. You can see Hugh's critiques and that sort of thing. We're going to be looking at that because I've had Hugh Farey on my show on a panel review, giving some critiques from his blog here about the WAXS method. So I'm going to play some of those and then get Giulio Fanti's responses to these. Here's part 2. So again, if you want, from a Shroud skeptical perspective, this is the most knowledgeable Shroud skeptic in the world, Hugh Farey. Again, not my favorite person right now because he's written a couple of blogs cutting me up. Regardless of the fact, Hugh is the most knowledgeable Shroud skeptic, and you do need to take into account what he has to say. So I've included skeptical sources on the blog, including an update from Hugh Farey sending me a private email on this as well. Make sure you look at all the sources, primary and pro and con. And for additional details, check out the BSTS website, Facebook, and newsletter, as well as shroud.com, and my own blog site and podcasts as well. Okay, great. So that's it from the the statement of the case from Giulio Fanti in his own words. Now, I've got another blog that I did even more recently. So this show was done April 23rd, 2022 is when I did that show where I was playing the clip of Giulio Fanti explaining his paper. It was literally just published at that time. Subsequent to that, I did a panel review with multiple experts, Bob Rucker, Russ Brault, and the infamous Shroud skeptic himself, Hugh Farey, where we talked about this. So I want to play the portion of that of this panel review show. Again, there's the sources in my blog for this show, including the 2 papers. But I want to play clips from this episode, this panel review show, where Hugh Farey and the others list some objections to this new WAXS method, as well as the other 3 physical dating tests that Giulio Fanti uses to date the Shroud of the 1st century. I'm also going to play clips from the Shroud skeptic Jordan from The Reason to Doubt. I highly recommend this show that they did, Breaking News, not so much. Yes, it's from a Shroud skeptical perspective, but I think Jordan is very fair, even when I disagree with his assessments. Like I said, he's providing substantive critiques, and he has an informed opinion. Whether you think he's right or wrong, obviously I do think he's wrong, but I would recommend this as a good Shroud skeptical source as well, at least for some level of analysis. Hugh Farey probably is more detailed and more thorough. His are more better than what Jordan can do in a 40-minute video, but nonetheless, check this out if you want some of an explanation. Yeah, so I'm going to be playing clips from the Shroud skeptics. What are some of the objections to this WAXS method? Is it too good to be true? Have we actually proved the Shroud is 1st century based on this X-ray dating and the 3 other techniques that Giulio Fanti is talking about? Well, let's get into that right now. Okay, so here's the panel review. Starting around the 8-minute mark, I turn it over to the panelists to give their take. And again, Russ Brault, world famous Shroud expert. Bob Rucker, who's not there, is world famous nuclear engineer and Shroud pro Shroud expert. And then Hugh Farey, the Shroud skeptic, world famous Shroud skeptic, or infamous, depending on your perspective. And here's where I'm turning it over to them. What is their take on these new dating methods? And this is where we'll play the clip in full. These are my videos. I don't have to cut them up or anything like that. But let's see, are there any objections to these techniques?
So Russ, since you're new, let's start with you. What's your take on these various empirical dating?
Well, I just admire the creativity and the resourcefulness of Giulio Fanti. Here we are, what was carbon dated in 88. What's this year? We're coming up on 2023, but 35 years past carbon dating. No attempt to date it again. We all know about the ridiculous sample location that was chosen, 1 sample from the outside corner edge. I mean, and now historically, we know, I don't know how much you guys know about, but now we know that corner was held and handled over 275 times from 1413 until 1694, when it was finally and permanently installed in the Guarini Chapel there in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. But all all the exhibitions annually prior to that was all held up, handheld, on platforms outside where people could see the shroud for hours. And then they would rotate people as well, because everyone wanted an opportunity to hold the cloth that ostensibly was the burial shroud of the crucified and risen Christ. So there are probably literally thousands of different hands holding that precise corner that was cut for carbon dating. So, I mean, of all the most stupidest things you could do would be to pick your one sample. The whole thing hangs on one sample from this particular location is just an absurdity that I just still can't wrap my head around. So having said that, I admire Fanti's creativity in to say that, well, I guess they're not going to let us carbon date it again. So maybe there must be some other ways that we can date this cloth. And so I think that looking at the natural deterioration of cellulose over the years, whether you're looking at, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy, whether you're looking at this wide angle X-ray scattering, whatever technique you want to use, I think, but when you are comparing it to other linens, made of a comparable material, flax, and then you can, compare them. I think that's a reasonable way to assign, a wide age parameter. I mean, Fanti's margin of error is 500 years. I mean, so he's giving it a broad measure, and it's so I just think it's an interesting approach. I know that the carbon labs and the carbon dating purists will cry foul and say it's unsubstantiated, it's undocumented, it's this and that. But hey, I give them an A for creativity and I give them an A for effort. And what needs to happen is more samples be made available so we can do some decent testing. So that's my take on it.
Awesome. All right, cool. And Bob, what's your take on these various empirical tests, dating tests?
Yes, I've been trying to specialize on the carbon dating with my background in nuclear engineering, and then after I think pretty much dealt with that issue, then I started expanding the whole concept to explain how the image was formed as well. And so, I have a new hypothesis on that, the vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis. But in the process of all that, I also make presentations. And I just finished a full day Shroud conference down in the Phoenix area, where I spoke from 8:30 in the morning to 5 in the afternoon, with breaks, of course. But in that process, I went through probably about 250 PowerPoint slides. So I was wondering here if I could just put my list of date indicators up, and I have 15 of them. What you mentioned were the last two.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah, go ahead and share your screen.
Well, I write them down.
Hugh's going to write them down for us.
Share screen. Okay, hold on.
He's got his.
This is my whiteboard. This is what I teach from.
And then you have Giulio Fanti's 3 different tests related to reflectance and tensile strength, which were dated to 33 BC to plus or minus 250 years. And then finally, the radiation damage to the fibers, according to Ray Rogers, at a very similar number of, what would you call it, radiation paths, ionization paths across the fibers, similar to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which dated to about 250 to 70 AD. So those would be my 15. So number 16 then would be the new methodology that Giulio Fanti came up here with, or DeCaro, was a primary author of X-ray dating of the Shroud. So my take on this, I tried to read it yesterday, and a lot of times scientific papers become not understandable. Yeah, even for me, and you know, my background is science. But what I found here was there was a lot of things that I didn't understand. There was a lot of specialty going on with the equations and where the equations came from and whatnot, and even the curves that he showed were not entirely clear as to what he's getting at. And I did not understand what the x-axis was, the Q value. Didn't understand what that is. And so there's a lot that I don't understand. But then he also gets into a lot of consideration with humidity and the temperature. And he then concludes that the value that was actually measured on this was unlikely to be consistent with the carbon dating, because that would have to be at a very high temperature for the 7 centuries. It's only existed according to carbon dating. It would have to have existed all that time at a very high temperature, which is unlikely based upon the locations where it has been kept. So that based on those temperature considerations, the conclusion in the paper was that it could well indicate a consistency with about 2 millennia of age. In other words, this is not an extremely precise dating mechanism, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the process. And as Russ said, this isn't a brand new dating technique. And if you think of carbon dating, how the accuracy and the size of the sample that was required when it was first invented, there's been tremendous advancements in carbon dating technology over the decades since it was created. And I suspect we'll have the same type of thing here. So that this is a brand new technology. The initial evidence on the Shroud of Turin has a very large uncertainty to it. And so I think you conclude that it's unlikely to be consistent with the carbon dating and possibly indicating an age of up to 2 millennia. So, given all of those qualifications, I think we have to wait and see how this dating technique develops. And it's going to have to be used on many more types of fabric in order to get a much larger database for comparison.
Well, as the old saying goes, necessity is the mother of invention. And when you're not allowed to carbon date it again, then you come up with other ways of dating it. And so I think that's why I think it's a very, creative idea
Yes.
that's been applied here. And even Fanti and DeCaro and all of them fully admit that this needs to be tested further on additional samples. But it does give an interesting indication, and it's so.
All right, cool. So turning to Hugh then for your opening take. What's your take on these empirical dating techniques that have been used?
Okay.
I'll just deal with Giulio's techniques, if I may. We've covered most of the others in great detail. If anybody wants me to comment on their views about other things, I'll do that. I agree with Russ in that if we could find a different way of dating material, archaeological material, other than radiocarbon dating it, that would be terrific. There's nothing better than having two systems which correlate to one another, because then you can see if the two things agree, then you go, yeah, that makes sense. And if they disagree, then you try the experiment again until you find out that the two dating techniques give you the date that you think is probably most likely. Of course, perhaps the best one for most archaeological sites is dendrochronology, is tree ring dating, because we can find a piece of textile or something like that, check its radiocarbon date. And as we do now, if we can, if there is actually a piece of tree that's part of the archaeological site, we can check it against the tree, and we've got a continuous record of tree rings from the present day to about, I don't know, 10,000 BC, perhaps more, so that we can literally check a piece of wood found on a site by the tree rings. We don't need carbon dating. Trouble is, of course, you can't do that with the shroud. So when we're looking at the shroud or the textile, what you're looking for is something that works like a clock. And the trouble with mechanical and, to a certain extent, radiation defects is that it doesn't work like a clock. The mechanical defects very largely depend, or mechanical deterioration, I should say, depends on three really important things. The first one is temperature, the second one is humidity, and the third one is bending it and folding it up and wrapping it round in circles. Literally, the mechanical treatment of it. And our problem is that it's terribly, terribly difficult to judge a material on objectively on all those three things. Now, I find, I don't think that as it stands, Giulio's method is going to achieve any kind of prominence. He's had 5 or 6 years now. His paper hasn't been read by most archaeologists, let alone commented on. And can I share the screen, because I'm going to show you why?
Yep.
If I may.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, can we see this?
Yes.
This is Giulio's collection of tested threads that he knew the date of, and so which he used for his calibration curve. Because obviously, whatever magic number you got out of the shroud, it wouldn't mean anything unless you can calibrate it with the magic numbers that you've come up with other things. Now, you can see that we start with a collection of textiles. They start with A, that's modern, and they end with L2. Now, I don't know, and I'm hesitated to be unkind, but what happened to C, E, G, H, I, K, H is there, but all the ones in between, did they exist at all, and were they rejected out of hand beforehand?
Yeah, he started off with far more samples than this, but he apparently eliminated them because he felt that they were too. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then these are the ones that he actually did use.
Wait,
and from the samples.
Sorry, Hugh. Like, what's the reason he eliminated them? You guys are about to say.
Well, I don't know. He doesn't say.
Okay, Russ, do you know?
They were inappropriate for one reason or another. I mean, he did mention that, for example, he could have used fibers from the Akeldama shroud, which is the only other Second Temple period burial shroud ever been discovered, but rejected it on the grounds that the tomb in which it was found was very damp, and the shroud had fallen to pieces, as indeed most of those early shrouds have.
Okay, all right, cool.
So that might be part of it.
I think that's why many of them were rejected, because of the environmental the conditions that they were,
So these were the ones that were not rejected on environmental grounds, and he extracted from them certain numbers of fibers, which you could see in column 4, fibers extracted. And he lists a number of fibers that he extracted from each one. And then he looked at all these fibers and he rejected a fair number of them, as you can see. And then during the course of testing them, he rejected a whole lot more. So that the ones that were finally used to produce his calibration graph are the ones in column 1, 2, 3, 4, column 7, where it says fibers used. And as a percentage, move that out of the way, as a percentage of the fibers that he started with, you can see that, well, one of them, the cloth from the Quarantal cliff in Israel, he started with 4 fibers and they all seemed satisfactory. But for some of them, down, especially the older ones, we've got 40%, 30%, 24%. That's the one from the early Middle Ages in El Fayum. Now, this kind of selection, it cannot but make you think that there's a certain amount of subjectivity about this. And that's why it'll never appeal to mainstream archaeologists. What you've got to do is to take a textile, grab a handful of fibers and test those fibers, regardless of what they are, unless you can come up with a very objective way of rejecting them. You can say, oh, I'm only going to take white ones instead of black ones. That perhaps would be a good idea, because the black ones would be all rotten and decomposed. But unless you give a very, very clear description of exactly how you chose your fibers, then it's going to be difficult to persuade anybody that your graph is not at least perhaps unconsciously, subjectively biased towards giving you the result that you were hoping for.
So, Hugh, it's kind of like the British Museum not providing all of the raw data to Nature in 1989, and which was what Tristan Casabianco published in Archaeometry in 2019. And it's
I couldn't possibly say, but this is these. Well, I think you can see from the data. This is, I mean, Giulio's been quite clear about it. This is not. I didn't have to get a freedom of information request to force him to publish this data. It was there in his paper. Bless him. But that's the reason why it's not going to achieve vast acceptance. Now,
Hugh, I agree with you. I think that but I think what Fanti, at least what I take away from Fanti, is that even though I probably need to talk to him about what was the criteria that he was using as to why he would accept or reject a particular fiber from each one of these different samples, but assuming he had a reasonable basis, I still come away with thinking that it seems to me to be a valid thing to compare the natural aging, however we want to define natural aging, however we want to measure it or assess it. It's this comparison concept seems theoretically to me holds water. Now, how we apply it, how we go about it, whether this is the right way or X-ray is the right way or some other way that we haven't even used yet. It's but it seems to me to be a valid approach by comparing it to other linens of a known age. Where we so again, so
only if you choose your right samples. I could get a modern bed sheet, and provided it had been slept in enough, I could make it at 2000 BC right up to 2000 AD just by picking the right fibers out of it and measuring them in exactly the same way. I'm absolutely certain that would be really easy to do. Of course, I'd reject this one because it was too wrinkled, and I'd reject that one because it's obviously damp, and I'd reject this one, and then I'd come up with the ones which, funnily enough, would exactly fit my original premise. Now, would I be allowed to go on to the X-ray, the recent X-ray experiment?
Yeah, I was just going to say, as the host, just to make sure I'm fair to all sides, Hugh, you can give your opening case uninterrupted, unless you don't mind. But give your opening case, and then
then I'll stop after this. Right. So the X-ray experiment was done on pieces of thread. It wasn't done on individual fibers. So what Giulio did, and he's got little pictures of it in his paper, is get a tiny tuft of thread. Where's my fingers here? Probably something like 5 millimeters high, something like that, and pass the X-ray scattering machine up and down it, taking various readings from it. And he describes that in great detail. It's Liberato di Curra, but it's basically Fanti's behind it. But Liberato did the actual work, I think. And he describes how he's taken these threads, and then from that he had to produce a completely new calibration scale. The trouble was that he used exactly the same textile samples that Giulio used in his paper. And as we can see, we find that round about 50% of those samples were unsuitable for dating. So how come they were unsuitable for dating when Giulio did it, but they were suitable for dating by doing it with X-rays? That seems to me perverse. I mean, for example, the sample from, let's take the weakest one, the sample from El Fayum in Egypt was only a quarter of the threads taken from that piece of textile were found to be appropriate for Fanti's dating, and yet the whole thing was taken for doing the De Caro's dating process. And that seems to me the two things, they don't coincide as well as they should. And I just don't think. We say, give it 10 years and see if archaeologists rise to the bait. But unless we can come up with a more objective way of choosing our samples, I don't think they're going to make it. So that was my assessment of it. It's all there in Medieval Shroud if anybody wants to read it.
Awesome. So that's your opening case finished?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So now what I'll do, I'll open it up so you guys can kind of have like an informal back and forth and discuss some of the criticisms or what you guys make. I guess I'll start with Russ since he went first in this round. Yeah, is there anything you want to discuss with the panelists about these dating methods?
No, I understand, and I understand the weaknesses that Hugh is pointing out regarding Fanti's method. Again, my understanding is that Fanti, eliminated certain fibers because he didn't feel like they were representative or whatever. I think we'll have to get Fanti on here and maybe Liberat. What's his name? I know Mr. De Caro, who wrote the article and did all.
Signor De Caro.
And I think obviously Fanti's involved because he provided the samples, that he had already done all the heavy lifting to basically find all these different samples of all these, various cloths.
It sounds like all the panelists are kind of agreed in terms of the empirical tests. They're at best suggestive, but more confirmation is needed on certain things before we should believe the shroud equals that date or something. Is that what
I would say that there's still a large uncertainty involved in it.
Well, I would say personally that there's as much uncertainty about Fanti's method as there is about the carbon-14, is because now you have the results of Tristan Casabianca's work showing that the one carbon-14 dating sample is not homogeneous. And you have Rogers' work that certainly shows that it is not representative of the main body of the shroud. So, I think we have a lot of problems with dating the cloth. Not just Fanti's method. We obviously have problems with carbon-14 as well.
Gotcha.
At least as regards to this artifact. I'm not impugning carbon-14 in general, but as they say, bad sample is bad data, and I think that's what we have here.
This kind of segment, it sounds like we're kind of done about these empirical dating tests. Now, Russ brought up a good point. So next week, for fans of the show, I will be bringing on Giulio Fanti to specifically address some of the objections that we're working on. He was kind enough to send me written objections because obviously Giulio doesn't speak English. That's why he couldn't be on this show and like interacting in real time type thing. But he will be on next week to address some of the objections here. But before
they were questions, not objections, weren't they?
Or question challenges or questions.
Queries for clarification.
And the paper is going to claim that the Shroud of Turin is too broken down to have been a 13th century cloth. This is the actual paper. So credit to Cameron for going to the actual paper and not just stopping with the Daily Mail. So that's good.
The WAXS analysis presented here for the natural aging of the cellulose in the linen of a TS Turin Shroud sample allows us to conclude that it is very probable that the Turin Shroud is a relic of about 20 centuries old, even if we only have European historical documentation for the last 7 centuries. Okay.
So that's important because the undisputed documented history, the history that is like very clear, no question, starts right at the 13th century when it shows up in France. There's a couple issues with the research that make it fall in the "this is interesting, but more time is needed" camp, I think. These are the fabrics they did. They tested a couple fabrics, including fabric from the Shroud of Turin. They tested a new fabric from Italy. They tested a fabric of known age from Egypt, another fabric of known age from Israel, another fabric of known age from Egypt, and then the Shroud of Turin. And so they're using these fabrics of known ages to kind of validate their method, right? And that's what the thing looks like. I'm going to skip most of the math. Just trust. And then here's this curve that has the different fabrics and kind of like the degradation of them. And the takeaway is their method confirms the ages for the samples of known age, and then says that the Shroud of Turin is 2,000 years old. So they say the degradation rate depends on the humidity. They use a relative humidity of 50% as like their baseline, and then adjust from there. And it also depends on the average room temperature in which the thing was stored. So change the temperature, that changes the rate of degradation, changes the humidity, that changes the rate of degradation. Because they try to include that. They say that an increase in relative humidity causes a linear increase or decrease in degradation. More humidity means more degradation. High humidity promotes new life. Molds, fungi, bacteria, insects, etc., which are most effective at destroying cellulose with respect to natural aging due to the action of room temperature. Therefore, ancient fabric are usually only well preserved in semi-desert or desert climates, as are linen samples found in the tombs of mummies analyzed in this source. So they are usually only well preserved in desert climates. That's where all their control samples came from, were desert climates, Israel and Egypt. Conversely, this preservation of fabrics in other parts of the world where relative humidity can be much higher than the semi-desert climates is not guaranteed. Relics are an exception due to their religious importance. So problem number one, which Savage brings up here, we're using a method sensitive to humidity and temperature to compare objects from uncontrolled archaeological sites to something that's been endorsed for centuries. Yes, that is what we are doing. That is absolutely correct. The Shroud of Turin's life has been tumultuous. If you look at it, it's been through some stuff, including a fire, for example. So I think it's a bit dubious to use a method that is so sensitive to temperature and humidity, right? Now, like I said, they tried, in fairness to the paper, they did try to address the fire thing, because they were
aware that there was a fire. Yeah,
they were aware that it's in a fire. So what they did was they baked cloth in a oven at 200 degrees Celsius, and then did their method. They did their test before and after, and it didn't have a significant effect. And so they said, okay, well, the fire wouldn't have been a big deal. That at least they tried to address it. I am not an expert in textiles, so I don't know how sufficient that might be, but they tried to address it. But here's the more important thing to me. That they only looked at cloths from Egypt and Israel as their controls here. But hey,
dry desert environments.
Which are dry desert environments. But hey, it's okay, because this is not the paper where they're like showing their method to the world. Maybe they did more in the previous one, right? Maybe in the 2019 paper where they were like describing their methodology, maybe that's where that stuff is, right? Table 1. This is where they describe the fabrics that they used in their testing, okay? Starts with B, new flax, raw flax. Flax is the plant that linen is made of.
So we got a control. Great.
And new bleached, so raw and bleached, okay. Medieval stuff determined to be medieval from carbon-14 dating from Israel. Medieval from Egypt. A mummy from Israel. A mummy from Israel. A mummy from Egypt. Are you seeing a theme here? A mummy from Egypt. A mummy from Egypt, and end of list. So they have used a method that they know is sensitive to environmental conditions, because it's based on the degradation of cloth, which is going to be sensitive to environmental conditions. They tested it exclusively on fabrics from deserts, from dry desert conditions, some of which have been, presumably, if they're mummies, sealed away for at least most of their history. Got this pattern of degradation, and then applied it to a cloth that had not been in a dry desert environment at all, for the last 700 years.
And who knows where it was, if it was actually older than the 14th, 13th century, right?
Right. So they try to address this by saying, okay, well, let's imagine it was only 700 years old. Where would it have to have been stored to get the degradation we see? But the problem is that their methodology has not been tested outside of dry desert environments.
To be able to compare that to. So like if they would have taken a cloth from France in a humid environment, and they would have taken a cloth from like Scotland or England where it's raining all the time, you know, you could then compare.
Maybe then you could draw some inferences. But as it is, there's nothing there. Moreover, there are going to be latent errors in this methodology because, of course, there are. It's a brand new methodology. There's going to be problems. Carbon dating is a great method. It has limitations. You can't use it on creatures that live in shallow water environments. It just doesn't work there. They found that out over time, testing it out. What are the pitfalls like that for this method? They don't know. And the reason we know we don't know is because they haven't convinced anybody else in the field to use it. Simply by virtue that if it hasn't been cited a bunch, it doesn't mean it's false. But if it has been cited a ton by a ton of experts, all of which have like looked at it, they've done maybe confirmation of their own, they've run their own experiments and confirmed it, that tells you that these experts in the field is saying this is a reliable thing. And that should give you as a layman more confidence. So nobody has cited the 2022 paper who are experts in the field using this methodology. But okay, maybe they're not citing it because that was about the Shroud. They just don't care about the Shroud, but they're going to use the method, right? So let's do some more research. Let's look at the 2019 one because that's the actual method, right? So that's the one we'd want people to be citing if they're using it a lot. And so here you do get some citations from actual like researchers. Cited by 20. So this one, evolution of ultrascience and polysaccharide composition of flex fibers, where history meets science. This one, if you go click on it, we can look at what they're saying. They are cited by, it was like 6 or 7 papers. None of them were confirming the method. All of them were just using bits and pieces of the information. So the moral of the story is this method, which is brand new, which is novel, has not been vetted, has not been tested, has not been accepted by the broader community. So we don't know what its limitations are. We don't know what pitfalls it is. We don't know if it's actually accurate at all. We certainly don't know if it's accurate outside of Egypt or Israel.
Okay, so that does it for the Shroud skeptics, with Jordan from Reason to Doubt and also the Shroud skeptic Hugh Farey about these dating methods, 4 dating methods, including the new X-ray dating by Giulio Fanti. And just to summarize, I count 3 main objections to respond to. The first is that the method is totally new, has not had time to be vetted within the field of secular archaeology or dating archaeological objects in ancient linens. So that's true. It's a brand new, these 4 techniques, physical dating tests, are new, they're novel approaches, and they haven't been tried and tested outside of these tests themselves. The second main objection is that the samples only come from the Middle Eastern area, specifically Egypt and Israel, and those are dry desert climates. So we don't know how, since they use those samples and those samples alone to calibrate their technique, how would that apply to samples in Europe, France, England, other areas? They should have used control samples from other areas that had different climates or different factors or conditions that may have affected the impact of that. And thirdly, related to that, is that this technique is heavily influenced by environmental factors such as humidity, temperature, and perhaps in the case of some of the methods, other factors such as how the cloth was treated mechanically, was it folded, stretched out? That could cause damage and stuff like that over time, as well as other factors such as acidity, so on and so forth, right? So these are the main objections that the Shroud skeptics have leveled. Now, I brought on Dr. Giulio Fanti onto my show for Shroud Wars Panel Review Part 3B, where I laid these objections directly to Giulio Fanti, and he provides his response to these. Now, just before I get to that, one last thing I will mention about Jordan. So he notes two papers. There's the 2019 paper, which talks about this X-ray dating technique specifically in general, laying out the method in general, published in the peer-reviewed journal 2019. Then he mentions the 2022 paper specifically about the Shroud, applying the X-ray dating to the Shroud and getting that non-medieval and or first century date. Incredible. However, I will say this. I think that Jordan missed the third paper from 2022, and I'll just show that now, from the journal Information, Long-Term Temperature Effects on the Natural Linen Aging of the Turin Shroud. This is by two people that I know, Dr. Caesar Barta, who I had on my show. He's an expert on the Sudarium of Oviedo, for example, and of course my friend Giulio Fanti, who was on the papers with De Caro for the other two papers. But this goes into that third objection, and I'm going to cover this paper because Jordan didn't, and none of the other popularizers like Cameron Bertuzzi or even on the Reason and Doubt channel, I don't think anyone has mentioned this newer paper that was published in August 29th, 2020, or September 28th, 2022. And again, this is for free on my blog, the same blog, Panel Review Part 3 and Part 3B. But anyways, before I get into that, I want to play Dr. Giulio Fanti and his responses to these Shroud skeptical objections to his 4 physical dating techniques, including the brand new X-ray dating. So let's see what Giulio Fanti has to say about this. Also, just a quick edit update note before I get into Giulio's response and playing that. As I said, Giulio, English is not his first language, so he speaks Italiano, he's an Italian, and so it is sometimes hard to understand what Giulio is saying when spoken, in terms of his spoken English. So I am putting the we'll be putting the closed captioning on to help you guys understand what he's saying. Even there, it's not perfect. So thankfully, Giulio Fanti was kind enough to actually type out in English all of his answers that he's saying in the show. So you can actually read along, and that'll help you understand if you can't understand what he's saying when he's speaking. So to find that, go to my blog. When you're watching the show, the Shroud Panel Review Part 3B, I provide the link to my blog. Otherwise, you can go to my main blog page, realseekerministries.wordpress.com. Just type in Fanti, and it's the first link that comes up. Shroud Wars Panel Review Part 3, Scientific and Textile Dating Evidence with Russ Brault, Bob Rucker, Hugh Farey, and Giulio Fanti. If you click that, I have all of my recommended sources and links with scholarly papers from all of the guests. But if you want to see the specific one right where he writes up his answers, it's called Giulio Fanti Part 3B Show Answers. And if you click that, it automatically, for free, pops up all of Giulio's answers that this is what he's reading from in the show itself. So this is word for word what he's saying, and it has all my questions, all of his answers in written English for the show. The first half is on the coins, so that isn't relevant to WAXS, but then we start getting into the different dating techniques like FTIR, Raman spectroscopy, tensile strength, and the X-ray dating, and he has his answers there to each of the questions I ask him. Follow along. If you're having trouble understanding him, you can read it and follow along as Giulio is saying it. So I just wanted to make you aware of that source on my blog for free. That will help you to understand, give you another way to understand by reading. All right, let's get into the video clip itself then and see what Giulio, how does he respond to these Shroud skeptics? Your FTIR and Raman spectroscopy and your tensile strength test, and as well your newest X-ray dating tests and what the results were for that.
To answer to this question is insufficient details. The listeners would first need to have taken specific courses regarding the method I used. Okay. However, I think it is enough for them to know that to carry out these dating methods, some optical, chemical, and mechanical properties of the flex fibers were chosen, which show changes that can be quantified over time on the basis of appropriate physical laws. To achieve this, we proceeded according to the following steps. We have identified a material property which varies over time and which should not visibly depend on other factors. We used a sufficiently numerous series of reference samples, ancient linen fabrics in our case, for the calibration of the method and the definition of the equation of the treated model. Before proceeding further, we thought and found theoretical confirmation of our obtained experimental results, also verifying the independence of the results from other effects such as temperature and humidity. We measured the property under examination by introducing the sample taken from the Holy Shroud into a commercially available or purpose-built machine, as in the mechanical case, capable of providing the age of the sample under test. We proceeded according to this scheme in the measurement of the representative parameters with the four methods: FTIR and Raman, which are based on infrared and laser optical analysis; tensile strength, which is based on the mechanical strength of the single flex fiber; and X-ray detection of cellulose depolymerization. In all cases, we obtain results contrary to the carbon-14 dating of 1988, which we know is scientifically unreliable for various reasons, but all extraordinarily coinciding with a dating to the 1st century after Christ, the time when Jesus Christ lived in Palestine.
Okay. Gotcha. Awesome. All right, cool. Okay, so just a couple general objections to these dating methods. One of the things that I mentioned to you last time when you were on our show is that, look, a lot of Shroud skeptics, they question the general reliability because these dating methods are very new and they haven't been accepted in wider scholarship. So what do you make of the fact that these methods haven't really been widely accepted in scholarship outside of Shroud studies?
All this superficial and tendential criticism made by people who are often ignorant of the subject and who therefore probably do not sufficiently understand the subject being treated are irritating and annoying. These seem to me almost always criticism formulated on the basis of a non-scientific, preconceived objective of another origin, perhaps even religious, which they want to satisfy at any cost, even ignoring the evidence, the goal of having to demonstrate that the Holy Shroud is not authentic. For example, it is here stated more or less directly that the method of mechanical dating of flex fiber is not reliable because no one but me has used it to date the archaeological finds. But before defaming a method that is at least interesting, is anyone who makes this denigration aware of what it needs to be done to obtain a reliable result? Does he know that at least 20 fibers selected as free from defects must be taken under a microscope and glued into suitable specially constructed supports? Is he aware that typically with the current procedure being improved, about half of the fibers fail to give reliable results for various mechanical assembly problems? Does he know that to get the Holy Shroud results, I had to employ my university students for 100 hours? Does he know that it is, if used for commercial purposes, a single result obtained from this method would be economically unfeasible because it would have a cost at least of $12,000. To make a parallel, the news has recently come out that a method for obtaining nuclear fusion has been discovered in the United States. However, it has stated that it will take at least 50 years before the discovery can be used by the population to obtain clean energy. Well, let's wait we too for another 50 years, and we will see if the mechanical dating method will be engineered and used for archaeological purposes.
Gotcha. Awesome. All right, cool. Well, one kind of follow up with this, and again, it's going to be one you don't like, but I have heard some Shroud skeptics question the possibility of fraud in terms of your work. So with question 8 here, for example, how do we know that the samples you got do actually come from the Shroud itself? So I wanted you to kind of answer this, like how do you answer to the question of fraud, and how do we trace the samples you're using for these methods to the Shroud itself?
This is a wicked question, and I hope you just pass on the thought of others without sharing it. And you think I have spent over 25 years of my life on a fraud? I'll answer you with a fact. In 1988, during the sample of the Holy Shroud for carbon-14 dating, cameras were used for several hours to objectively document the sampling. But these cameras did not record the moment in which the expert went to another room to seal the samples just taken. This lack of visual documentation may suggest that there was a replacement of the samples taken from the Holy Shroud with other of known data. Similarly to what you implied, if there is no a minimum of confidence in the experimenter, then I could say that the 1988 C-14 date is false because the samples have been replaced. As for my Holy Shroud samples, see photo number 7. Can you please show it, please? I officially received them with signed documentation, which I also published in my book written with Pier Andrea Murphy. In this photo, we see on the left the cover of the book where the following documents are published. In the center, one of the various deliveries to me by the 3M Foundation of Milano Segrate, and on the right, the document transferred to me by Stera Inc. of samples of stick tapes taken from Ray Rogers in 1978. I finally must observe that the linen samples from the Shroud, can you please show photo 8? These samples are easy to recognize because they have very rare physical and optical features. As seen in the photo above, the Holy Shroud threads have a zeta twist, that is the opposite of S twist that almost all woven linen threads have. Furthermore, you can see in the figure below the coloring of the individual fibers coming from the Holy Shroud have a particular shape if they are seen in a cross-polarized light under a petrographic microscope. We also see on the right that the same fiber of the Holy Shroud changes its coloration if the polarization angle is rotated. Obviously, I carried out checks of these types on the samples officially supplied to me.
All right. Thank you very much for for that. I knew you didn't like that question, but still, Shroud skeptics raise it. So thank you for addressing it and giving your take on that. So, okay, so I want to move on to specific objections to these physical dating and the X-ray dating and that sort of thing that was raised on the show by Hugh Farey. So Hugh kind of says, look, in terms of the X-ray dating, you dated the whole threads instead of the individual fibers. And he thinks this might be significant because it was noted above that when you did the other dating tests, you used the fibers specifically, and you rejected a bunch of those fibers from any single thread. But yet here in the X-ray dating, you were using those whole threads themselves. So yeah, he's just saying, like, how do you respond to this? And also, why are there no margins of error or, like, you know, a 95% degree of certainty with the X-ray dating?
Knowing that who posed this question read my works very in detail, one can have a strong doubt about the intelligence of the person who formulated this question. However, I observe his fine intelligence and his astuteness, which, with this question, exploited the obvious unpreparedness of many listeners to instill in them doubts about the reliability of my results. Let me explain. Anyone who has read my works knows that the individual fibers on the olive shroud were sampled either by means of adhesive tapes placed in contact with the fabrics or aspirated, vacuumed with a suitable device. It is therefore obvious that these samplings acquired both the linen fiber from the olive shroud and the material that contaminated the relics for 2000 years. In the samples taken in this way, it is therefore easy to think that there are many fibers different from those of the olive shroud, and that therefore it is necessary to apply a subsequent method of analysis for their recognition. Unless, and this is an extremely absurd hypothesis, whoever formulates the accusation seems to think that I myself spun the fibers thus taken to form a new thread to be studied. A thread from the Holy Shroud was obviously spun 2000 years ago, using fibers of flax of the same species. So, the allegation that I analyzed a thread containing half of the unrepresentative fibers is clearly false and absurd. As for the uncertainty that has not been assigned to the site work on X-ray analysis, see paper 1 in photo 9. Can you please show photo 9? It has been estimated to be of the order of very few centuries. It was preferred to omit in this first work because it was our intention to publish it in the second work, published in the some month later. That is shown in paper 2. The second one, in the same photo, where we focused more on the effects of humidity and temperature of the sample of the olive shroud exhibited in the various cities of its historical journey. In this work, we have in fact considered the different possible historical paths proposed for the olive shroud by different scholars, and for each of them, we have evaluated the uncertainty corresponding to the dating performed. It is frustrating to see what level of accusation people go to against the authenticity of the Holy Shroud, in order to try to convince some of the listeners that the most important relic of Christianity may be not authentic.
Awesome. All right, cool. Thank you so much for that. Kind of the next question 10 is sort of in the same line here, right? So it's focusing in on the sample selection. This is what Hugh brought up at length. This was his main objection is in the X-ray dating again, the mechanical dating, the choice of these fibers. So you had 139 fibers were extracted, but only 46 of these contributed to the results that you got. And Hugh is kind of saying, well, this is too subjective to be credible type deal. So I just want to share my screen for a quick second and just show like the chart that Hugh was talking about in the show. So if you see, so this is what Hugh showed us, right? So you can see the samples, and he was asking, where's sample C? Why you're only using about 57% of the fibers here, or 24% of the fibers. So I think his main challenge is, like what are you selecting these samples? So yeah, what's your answer to question 10?
I consider this an insult to my professionalism as a university professor when it is declared this is too subjective to be credible. But frequently, when the arguments to defend one's thesis are scarce, the person who produces the results is directly attacked. Therefore, I do not get down to defend myself against accusation coming from a person who, from what I know, has never been a university professor, and that at most should be discussed at the table by clarifying the individual's details that are not interesting for the public. Instead, I limit myself here to provide a satisfactory answer to the listener. The man who accuses me, probably deliberately, forgets that the assembly procedure for the fibers analyzed from a mechanical point of view was very delicate, and for various reasons, only about 1 out of 3 fibers could provide results without breaking or sliding from the support. As for the use of a wall linen thread coming from the shroud, I have already answered before, and I repeat that it is unthinkable and absurd to affirm that half of the thread is unsuitable.
Okay, awesome. All right, thank you so much for your answer on that one. Okay, so one thing that is also raised up in question 11 is obviously you've kind of mentioned in your answers here that there are factors to take into account, and they are variable, and that can influence the results that you're getting. So, for example, things based on temperature, humidity, acidity, and mechanical deformation, how the cloth was treated throughout the centuries. So Hugh kind of says, well, look, all of Giulio's control samples that he tested to get his calibration curve were from very similar environments, namely the Middle East. And this isn't a proper test because the shroud, according to Hugh, is largely unknown in terms of these various factors. So Hugh is saying, like, why didn't you use a much wider selection of linen, from places like Peru or medieval Europe and or even Japan or Canada and stuff, and have that wider selection to test for these variables?
It is not at all true that carbon-14 dating is unaffected by environmental conditions. Already Professor Phillips said in the important journal Nature of 1989 that the carbon-14 dating may have been influenced by the energy that produced the Holy Shroud double body image that it is unexplained scientifically today. Furthermore, the radiocarbon dating of Egyptian mummy number 1716, kept in the Manchester Museum, provided different ages for the bones and the bandages. These last were about 9,000 years younger. These last were about 900 years younger than the bones. If the radiocarbons dates were trustworthy, it would lead to the absurd conclusion that the corpse would have been wrapped in the bandage about 900 years after his death. The obvious explanation for this is due to the effects of the environmental conditions. The hypothesis was at least partially confirmed by me in a recent publication. Can you please show the last slide, photo 10? In this publication, I reported the results of an analysis of the elements contained in a microscopic sample of blood taken from the shroud. Unlike common human blood samples, where nitrogen is evidenced among other elements in the relative spectra, in the sample from the Holy Shroud, the trace of nitrogen is so small that it hides behind the background noise. This, therefore, is a strong indication that, following the hypothetical intense radiation that produced the double body image, the nitrogen present in the blood was transformed in carbon-14, thus altering the isotopic ratio between carbon-14 and carbon-12, and therefore heavily altering the value of the hypothetical age of the analyzed sample. Those who criticize me about the sample selected seem not to realize the hundreds of hours that my students spent and I spent analyzing from a mechanical point of view the fibers used for the calibration of the method, after the effort I made to recover those ancient fibers. Why doesn't he provide me with all the material he criticized me for not using? Who criticized me then seems that he has not read my papers because I had to discard some ancient samples from the analysis, such as that of Lima, Peru, for mechanical reasons. Furthermore, the general criticism made to me regarding the lack of analyzed samples seems only malicious because, as I wrote in my papers, this method of mechanical dating still needs to be perfected, and for this reason, the uncertainty assigned to the result is still very high, plus minus 400 years.
All right, cool. So I think the last so this question 12 then the last on the X-ray dating is so for the WAXS experiment, Hugh says that a thread was taken from the radiocarbon corner, which according to some pro-shroud experts say like that was the worst possible place, right? That there's an invisible reweave there. Yeah, he's kind of challenging, why would you conduct an experiment from that radiocarbon corner when so many people say that's the wrong place to test?
It seems very strange to me that this person, opposed to the authenticity of the relic and still one of the few defenders of the highly criticized 1988 carbon-14 results, would make an objection of this type. If for this reason, if for this person who now, in order to criticize the results of my decades-long studies on these subjects, embraces even for a moment the idea that the corner from which the sample was taken was unreliable and scientifically incorrect because it was contaminated, it means that he himself questions the results of the radiocarbon dating, which up to now he defended against all logic. Well, this means that little by little we come to the truth. I used a piece of thread coming from that area because the crystalline properties of the cellulose do not depend on the alleged pollution. Indeed, the X-ray analysis performed have just highlighted the presence of contaminants which, such as calcium carbonate, but obviously these results did not affect the dating of the sample of the 1st century after Christ, because this information is far from the point of interest in the spectra.
Thank you so much for that. I think that covers the list that we agreed upon for the questions. But just the last question there for 13, I just want to throw it open to you. Do you think that there's anything that I didn't ask you about or that I've missed about these dating methods that you feel it's really important to speak about to the audience?
Obviously, regarding the new dating methods being new, they will certainly have to be improved and engineered in the next future for wide-ranging application in archaeology. However, it is very significant that all dating methods agree with a 1st century AD age for the Holy Shroud. The only method that has provided discordant results is that of the carbon-14, which, however, we know was statistically unreliable. Before closing, however, I would like to mention an extremely important fact that did not emerge from today's interview. The Holy Shroud shows a double body image, which is not scientifically explainable and therefore not even reproducible. After more than 25 years of studying this relic, I am sure that this image is the proof that Jesus Christ wanted to leave us of his resurrection. The double body image imprinted on the Holy Shroud is the only image of the whole body of Jesus Christ wanted to leave us. This image is very significant, even if not easy to interpret. In fact, according to Pope Benedict XVI, it is the mystery of cross and of light. In it, we see the signs of the immense pains suffered during the passion of Jesus, but we also see the sign of his resurrection. One can then think to the following question: why Jesus wanted to leave us this message imprinted in the most important relic of Christianity? My personal answer is that we too, pilgrims on earth, must carry our cross in order to try to become citizens of heaven in the future. Unfortunately, this proof of resurrection pushes many persons to do everything to denigrate and discredit it. And at the end of this interview, I am compelled to put in evidence again that the criticism raised against the results here discussed highlight the malice towards the truth seekers inherent in science. These persons know they are not right, but they make the public, which cannot be expert in such a specific subject, believe they are. I consider the attitude of this person a clear insult to the effort of serious scientists who for years dedicated their lives to discovery of the valuable information still hidden in the most important relic of Christianity.
All right, so that was Giulio Fanti responding to all of these Shroud skeptical objections against the WAXS dating method, as well as the other 3 physical dating tests, all placing the Shroud of Turin in the 1st century, as Giulio Fanti and the other scientists involved have proven scientifically in their peer-reviewed papers. Okay, last but not least, I want to cover something that it seems like all the other popular level channels and even the more scholarly level, although Jordan's podcast on Reason to Doubt, they did miss this 3rd paper written in 2022 in September of that year, long-term temperature effects on the natural linen aging of the Turin Shroud, where they address one of these objections about, what are the effects of temperature and humidity in terms of dating the shroud using this wide-angle WAXS method, wide-angle X-ray scattering technique. Okay, so here's the paper. Even more, this is breaking news, folks.
New scientific proof the shroud is authentic. Breaking news.
New.
This was the most recent paper, Long-Term Temperature Effects on the Natural Linen Aging of the Turin Shroud. And I'll just read the abstract. So in 2021, wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WAXS, was applied to a sample of the Turin Shroud as a new method for dating ancient linen threads by inspecting their structural degradation, or depolymerization. The major result of the research was to estimate the natural aging of the linen of the shroud, through which it was found to be compatible with the hypothesis of a 2,000-year-old relic and not compatible with a medieval fabric. Sorry, skeptics. No! The present work regards the theoretical natural aging of the linen versus different alleged historical geographical paths of the shroud through cities where the presence of icons of Jesus Christ are attested. The theoretical results of the natural aging of the shroud, calculated for the year 2021, agree extremely well with the experimental results for at least one alleged path. The results also show that if the shroud were medieval and kept in Europe for 7 centuries, under the known, this is what shroud skeptics keep forgetting. Since the 1300s, we know exactly where the shroud was. Its provenance is fully known, and the conditions, generally speaking, very well known, under which the shroud was kept. So we don't have to worry about, different temperature changes and climate changes and stuff like that, because we know where the shroud was and it was kept indoors. And that's relevant because that stabilizes the temperatures and humidity factors and other factors, which would interfere with getting an accurate reading on this front. So, and they mentioned that in this paper as well. But this paper goes beyond, because they also outline there are 4 different theories as to where the shroud was pre-medieval times. And they factor that real world data into the test. And they say they come up with one alleged path. Let me just show. I think it's section 2 where they outline the different paths. Yep, alleged paths. So they tested 4 different paths. These are based on the not made with human hands images traditions in the Byzantine Empire. And they test out, so they have the Camilliana, which is the Antioch hypothesis, although that's messed up because Jack Marquardt doesn't believe it was ever in Camellia or Camilliana, however you say it. There's the Memphis tradition, there's the image of Edessa hypothesis, and there's the image of Beirut, which I don't believe. And this is another theory, that the shroud was the image of Beirut, supposedly as a different trajectory for the cloth. And apparently this study supports this path, although it's not necessary for this path. So this study hasn't ruled out the other paths, but as you'll see in the study, the Beirut historical geographical path best fits the data from this study. The results also show that if the shroud were medieval and kept in Europe for 7 centuries, natural aging that is 1 order of magnitude less than that measured by WAXS would have resulted. Today, the shroud is kept in a reliquary with a controlled atmosphere, 19 to 20 degrees, 50% relative humidity. These values are shown to be unsuitable for maintaining the depolymerization of the cellulose at a level that is sufficiently low enough to preserve the image visible on the shroud for a long time. So they have some very interesting conclusion. All right, so in conclusion, it is probable that for the entirety of its history, the shroud has been kept either in churches or in other private buildings, thereby suffering the natural aging of linen due to monthly variations in temperature and relative humidity. Moreover, water absorption, nonlinear effects in the moisture of textiles could have also contributed to the depolymerization of the linen cellulose. Therefore, in this work, to perform a more reliable theoretical estimation of the natural aging of cellulose, the approximation of the average secular temperature and relative humidity used in our previous works. So this was one shroud skeptic said, oh, it has to be 20 to 22 degrees Celsius. Oh, you can't maintain that. Well, now with this new study, totally irrelevant, shroud skeptic. You're out to lunch. You're behind the times. My gosh, what are you still living in April 2022? Come on. We're way beyond that since September of 2022. All right, so get with the program, Shroud skeptics. Fun delay, Shroud skeptics, I'll say, because Jordan, I have respect for it, kind of thing. But yeah, this paper takes care of these kind of issues. With the new model, the different natural aging process of the linen of the shroud has been theoretically estimated versus different alleged historical geographical paths, along with the estimation of its sojourn before its arrival in Turin. Many scholars think that the ancient traditions of the not made with human hands, that's what this Greek word means, images of Jesus Christ could be related to the shroud. There are historical sources for these images present in several localities. The most important are Memphis, Edessa, Beirut, and Constantinople or Kamaliana in Turkey. In any case, the theoretical simulations show that the WAXS evaluation of the natural aging of the shroud is compatible with the 2,000-year history and scientifically impossible, falsified to be compatible with a medieval history of the Shroud of Turin, even if all possible geographical and historical, both known and alleged, constraints are considered. So yeah, that's it in terms of the WAXS method. So yeah, that's it for the first half of this thing. In conclusion, I think that the WAXS is proof that the shroud is not medieval on a balance of probabilities, and I do believe it proves the shroud is probably dating to the 1st century when used. This is especially the case when it's used in conjunction with the other 3 dating methods, because all of the 4 dating methods, including X-ray dating, place the shroud in the 1st century. That's the only century that is consistent with every single of all 4 of these methods. That's where they all overlap in terms of their wide error bars. Remember, Giulio Fanti is being extremely biased against these dating techniques. He has extremely wide margins of error, 500 plus or minus 500 years or 400 years in some cases for the dates that he gives. So he's allowing a wide range of possibility for error because these methods are new and because they haven't been totally vetted. So that accounts for, that solves this problem to a large degree, I would say, about, well, what if these methods are erroneous or something? Well, he allows for wide deviation or wide margins of error on the magnitude of like 500 years or something. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say about the WAXS method. That's about an hour there. So let's move on to the second fan request based on Hugh's hypocritical hit piece. Specifically, this is about one of his objections to one of my arguments about the carbon-14 dating and some quotes I gave from qualified secular peer-reviewed and sources and carbon-14 scientists talking about how the AMS carbon-14 method as of 1988 was pitiful and was not provably equipped to date the Shroud of Turin or linen textiles like the Shroud of Turin. The second fan request that I received and this is from a pro-shroud expert. I won't give any details for privacy sake, but this is related to Hugh Farey's hypocritical hit piece blog that he wrote up against me. And I already kind of responded to it in general, looking at the 3 things Hugh wanted me to address, and went over what he said about me in his lying blog and stuff like that, and gave my response to that. And I consider that my defense. It's over now. I waited a few days. It doesn't look like Hugh is going to repent of his sins, of his lies, saying to my face that he would never say that I'm a liar or that I lied or that I'm dishonest. And yet in his blog, he has that up there and he's chosen not to make that disclaimer. Very well. Jesus will judge him on Judgment Day. That's between him and God at this point. All I can do is be ready to forgive upon his repentance if he ever does put that disclaimer up on his blog. But this isn't about me and Hugh. I've put that, I'm moving on kind of thing. However, I did get a fan request from a pro-shroud expert who was sincerely curious about one of the things that Hugh attacks me on in his blog related to the carbon-14 dating. And this was not one of the 3 issues Hugh asked me to respond to. And so I didn't cover it in my own, my show, Hugh's Hypocritical Hit piece. And so as a fan request, I will, I'll respond to that now in case anybody else is interested in this aspect. So this aspect is specifically, let me just share my screen. It's actually the first thing that Hugh brings up. And on his blog, so absence of evidence, making it up, the first section he has about the radiocarbon dating is he takes issue with my issue. I wish I could make it bigger for you guys, about the general unreliability of the AMS carbon-14 dating method with risk, and I clarify this in the show, with respect to dating the Shroud of Turin in 1988 as a textile in 1988. And I provide various quotes as to why I think, yeah, there are significant problems. And I quote secular carbon-14 scientists and scientific studies proving that the AMS carbon-14 dating technique and carbon dating in general was unreliable and had proven problems at the time, which should give us reasonable doubt as to whether we can trust carbon dating in 1988 and AMS carbon-14 dating in particular as well, in terms of dating the Shroud of Turin and giving us a reliable date as to the actual calendar age. And Hugh takes issue with that in section 1. So first, before I get into Hugh's criticisms, let me just play what this slide was for you guys in full context. So here's where I start talking about this as one of the reasons a rational person would not be justified or should have reasonable doubts in believing the Shroud is medieval based on the carbon-14 dating results. In the first place, it has to be admitted, carbon-14 dating in general is a reliable dating technique for archaeological artifacts and that sort of thing. There are always assumptions or problematic cases, but with respect to the Shroud, they were using a new type of carbon-14 dating technique known as AMS, or accelerator mass spectrometry carbon dating. And at the time it dated the Shroud, it was only about 10 years old. I'll just pause it right there. That's something, so Hugh apparently says that, this wasn't one of the things I was going to respond to, but Hugh says this is a lie in his blog as well. This is true. It was around the late 1970s that Harry Gove and his other co-inventor invented AMS carbon-14 dating. So I have zero clue why Hugh in his blog says that it wasn't 10, that this is wrong, that it's 10 years old. This is correct. I don't even have a basis for understanding why he would say that's a lie. Okay. That's just an aside though. So yeah, let's continue on with what I said for Oakwood's Bible study on this slide. It had just been invented 10 years prior, and it was actually known for being unreliable with respect to dating textiles like the Shroud. And I just want to quote carbon-14 scientists. These are not pro-Shroud people. These are just secular carbon-14 scientists. And this is what they had to say. So in 1989, at the time, New Scientist magazine published a paper about a detailed study by Britain's Science and Engineering Research Council. And they actually did a study comparing the accuracy of about 38 carbon-14 labs using artifacts of known age as controls. What was their final conclusion? They said, quote unquote, the margin of error with the AMS carbon-14 dating seems to be as much as 2 to 3 times as great as practitioners of the technique have claimed. Of the 38 labs investigated, only 7 produced results that the organizers of the trial considered to be satisfactory. And as part in that same article, Dr. Murdoch Baxter, the director of the Scottish University's Research and Reactor Centre at East Kilbride, he said, quote unquote, it is now clear that other unaccounted for sources of error occur during the processing and analyzing of the samples. The AMS labs in particular were way out when dating samples as little as 200 years old. And this even as of late as is 2004, there was a peer-reviewed journal in which one of the most famous carbon-14 scientists in the world, Dr. Lloyd Curry, he said, with respect to dating the Shroud in particular, quote unquote, a wave of questioning has followed of possible artifacts that could have affected the carbon-14 result. The question of non-contemporaneous organic matter artificially adding to the carbon-14 content and therefore making the Shroud date younger than it should, the medieval period instead of first century, that came from oil, wax, tallow, smoke, and bacterial attack. The effects of such can be very serious and complex a matter in relation to the Shroud, and therefore is deserving of new quantitative investigation for the possible impacts on measurement accuracy. Again, this is not some Christian pro-Shroud guy. This is Dr. Lloyd Curry, one of the most famous carbon-14 scientists in the world, who's saying this. Now, in addition to this, the 3 labs that ended up carbon dating the Shroud in 1988, they actually conducted an intercomparison test in 1983. Just because there was some concern, this is a brand new method, how would they do? So they actually did a test to see. And all of the labs, when they tested 3 samples of a known age, and guess what? All 5 of the labs got the ages wrong by half the known age in a total of 7 out of the 17 experiments. So this is extremely unreliable. Okay, so that in full context is the part that this person who read Hugh's blog would like me to respond to Hugh's criticisms. So, okay, what are Hugh's criticisms? Let's start in the order that he gives. And the first is he attacks this study, this intercomparison test that New Scientist magazine is talking about. So in the first place, let's see what Hugh's objections were. So let me just bring that up for you in my Word. I've copied and pasted that in my Word document. To support this claim, Glover refers to 2 interlaboratory comparison tests, the first of which is the interlaboratory comparisons were both published in Radiocarbon and were readily available. So it seems a pity that Glover should get his evidence about the first from the article in New Scientist magazine, which misattributes the sponsor of the experiment, misquotes the conclusions, and relies upon a clearly disgruntled scientist whose lab did not fare well for an opinion. So first things first, notice that Hugh is actually admitting here that I was correct in the quotes that I gave, and that New Scientist, my source, according to Hugh, is where I'm getting it from, and I'm quoting it correctly. So here, let me just bring up. So here's the, you can find the unexpected errors affect dating techniques. September 30th, 1989 in New Scientist magazine. And right here, here's the first quote I gave, right? The margin of error with radiocarbon dating, an analytical method for finding out the age of ancient artifacts, may be 2 to 3 times as great as practitioners of the technique have claimed. That's exactly as I've quoted in my blog. So I'm correct. And I'm correct that there was this intercomparison test, right? Britain's Science and Engineering Research Council commissioned the accuracy of 38 labs, and Murdoch Baxter is the one that they're interviewing, and he matters because he was one of the organizers of this trial. And in fact, you're going to see his name when I go to the peer-reviewed paper. You're going to see his name as one of the scientists, the carbon-14 scientists, secular, not a pro-Shroud guy, who is on. Hugh is kind of, to use his standard, he's lying to the people, right? Because he's manipulating data. He gives only one source. There's actually 2 peer-reviewed papers because there are, I'll get into it in a bit, but there are 3 stages Hugh only mentions the last stage. I could accuse him of lying to you because I looked up, and I will provide in my blog, stage 1, the results of stage 1, stage 2, which is actually more relevant because that's where they carbon dated and tested with 37 labs, not 38, 37, to test on cellulose. That's what the shroud is made of. As a linen cloth, it's made of cellulose. So actually stage 2 is more relevant than the results of stage 3, you might want to say. That said, it does look like in New Scientist, they're kind of looking at stage 3 after they've completed all stages of the study. And in stage 3, they do get 38 labs. And that does appear to be what Murdoch-Baxter in this quote that I give is talking about. So I'm not going to play Hugh's game, and I'm not going to say, oh, well, why is Hugh hiding stuff? Why is he distorting the data and not telling you about stages 1 and 2? Well, because in the principle of charity, because it's not relevant. Look, I gave a quote. It seems that the quotes are talking about stage 3. That said, stages 1 and 2 are a part of this study as well. And stage 2 is going to be relevant because that's where we tested cellulose, which is what the shroud is. Okay, so here's the article. I copied and pasted it in full. And look, so I gave that quote. So I was correct in the quote. Now, Hugh says that they misquote the conclusion. He doesn't tell us what the conclusion is in either the peer review paper or in New Scientist magazine. So maybe they're not. I'm assuming he's talking about my quote, which is of the 38, only 7 produced results that the organizers of the trial considered, let me just make that bigger for you guys, considered to be satisfactory, exactly like what I said in the quote that I got. Murdoch-Baxter, the director of the Scottish University's research at East Kilbride near Glasgow, and one of the organizers of the trial, said that the survey represented a major turning point in the history of the method. His lab was only one of 3 from Britain that participated. All 38 participants had a date of a set of samples made from wood, peat, and carbonate. So this is talking about specifically stage 3 only. The laboratories involved were on average 2 to 3 times less accurate than implied by the range of error they stated. So one thing I'll state here is that, okay, it seems like they are talking about all 38 participants, which includes non-AMS labs as well, in addition to conventional carbon dating or there are 2 other new carbon-14 dating techniques that were also in the testing against Harry Gov's AMS carbon-14 dating as well. Some of these are involved in terms of it's not just testing only AMS, but the problem is the results. As even Hugh admits from the peer-reviewed papers, the carbon-14 labs sucked. They performed horribly, and that's including the AMS labs. But first, let's keep going with what New Scientist says so that you see I'm not lying. It is now clear, says Baxter, that other unaccounted for sources of error occur during the processing and analysis of samples. He suspects the most serious unforeseen errors arise in the chemical pretreatment of samples. Here are the other 2 methods that I was talking about, right? The gas proportional carbon-14 dating technique and the liquid scintillation dating technique. These are more conventional methods against the newer AMS method. Baxter says that the accelerator mass spectrometry, so AMS in particular, used last year by a laboratory at the University of Oxford to date the Turin Shroud, allegedly the burial cloth of Christ, came out of the survey badly. AMS sucked, according to this world's expert and who was the organizer. I believe him, not you, Hugh. Murdoch-Baxter was the one who, he has his name on a peer-reviewed paper. I believe a carbon-14 scientist over and above a high school teacher with a proven bias to disbelieve the shroud no matter what, and to just blindly believe in the carbon-14 dating results no matter what. He's right, you're wrong until you have proof that the opposite is the case. And therefore, based on the principle of scholarly testimony and credible testimony, I had every right, based on this article, which, by the way, Hugh, when it comes to Murdoch-Baxter's quotes, we'll get back to Hugh's blog. Does he say, well, that was a misquotation? He says they got the conclusion wrong. New Scientists got the conclusion wrong. It's not true that of the 38 labs, only 7 produced results that the trial considered to be satisfactory. And on that front, when you look at the peer review, Hugh is correct on that, okay? From what I can tell, if this is the conclusion that they're going for. That Hugh is talking about, again, he doesn't tell us what the conclusion is that he's saying they misquoted. Did they get the sponsor wrong? I have no idea. I don't care about that. That wasn't relevant to my quotes or anything I said in the show, so who cares? But when it comes to the quotes of Dr. Murdoch-Baxter, a carbon-14 scientist, this high school science teacher with a proven bias against the Shroud, says he knows better than Baxter and that Baxter's lying to you. Why? Because he was, quote unquote, clearly disgruntled that his lab didn't perform well in the test. I don't see anywhere in this interview in New Scientist where it says Baxter was disgruntled. Heck, I read all 8 pages. I read the full reports, both of them, the peer-reviewed papers in Radiocarbon Journal. Nothing in there says that Murdoch-Baxter was clearly disgruntled and therefore lied to New Scientist magazine. There's nothing in there that talks about him being disgruntled. So this is Hugh making stuff up. He doesn't like what Baxter has to say. He disagrees with it. And so he lies. He makes something up out of whole cloth, literally, about Murdoch-Baxter's psychological state. Well, he said this, but it's not true. He just said it because he's, quote unquote, clearly disgruntled. No proof in Hugh's blog. He just makes that up. Pathetic, Hugh. Pathetic. I believe him, not you, Shroud skeptic. Sorry, I believe a secular carbon-14 scientist over a biased, skeptical high school teacher, science teacher. Sorry. Okay, going on with, again, Baxter says that some of the accelerator laboratories were way out when dating samples as little as 200 years old. Again, Hugh doesn't deny this is true. He doesn't deny any of this about what Baxter is saying. Again, the organizer of the study itself. His name is one of the head scientist names on the peer-reviewed papers that we're going to be looking at in a second. And he goes on, because so little material is used in accelerator mass spectrometry, the effects of chemical pre-treatment are likely to be more serious than compared to conventional techniques. AMS is worse than other techniques because so little material is used. And therefore, the effects of chemical pre-treatment are much more serious on its results, says Baxter. Now, this is going to be important, this aspect here, as to why Murdoch-Baxter is saying that the AMS labs suck compared to other labs, therefore proving my point that AMS, carbon-14 dating, is worse than other techniques, or worse than the more conventional technique, or we have, at the very least, we should have reasonable doubts about AMS in particular in terms of dating the Shroud of Turin reliably and getting an accurate calendar age. But let's see what Hugh argues in his blog that this is totally wrong and opposite to the study. Okay, so Hugh goes on in his blog, he says, looking at the peer-reviewed paper, the comparison is the report on stage 3 of the International Collaborative Program by blah, blah, blah. Okay, it deals with results from 38 labs, of which 5 were AMS. By agreement with the laboratories, the report does not identify them. True. However, from its data, it is easy to see that the AMS labs clearly came out best. Really? So he's contradicting Dr. Murdoch-Baxter, the world's expert in carbon-14 dating, an actual carbon-14 specialist, a scientist, the one who headed up, one of the organizers of this very study. And Hugh, a biased high school teacher, science teacher, thinks he knows better than the PhD carbon-14 scientist as to what his own peer-reviewed paper says. I don't think so, Hugh. I believe him, not you. But let's see what is Hugh's basis, because he does present reasons, which, as we'll see, are technically speaking true from the peer-reviewed paper, right? So Hugh has a basis for this, but let's see if he's manipulating you. So Hugh says, each lab was judged against 3 basic criteria, absolutely correct, and given a pass or fail for each one. Interesting, he doesn't tell you what those 3 criteria are. Well, I'll show you in the peer-reviewed paper, but there's internal consistency. There's also external consistency, if I remember correctly, and I'll show it in the peer review paper itself. And then finally, there's systematic bias. The AMS labs failed on the systematic bias criterion, which is interesting because that's what pro-Shroud scientists have been saying since 1988, since 1989, calling out the clearly systemic bias, and now provable in the peer-reviewed papers themselves as of 2019 and beyond, that there is this provable systematic bias. You know, that's what Bob Rucker has been talking about. So it looks like pro-Shroud Christians have been correct the whole time here. And we should have known better, even as of this early time. But anyway, so 2 of the 5 AMS labs failed to meet the 3 basic criteria for an adequate performance. And he gets this from table 3. We can see that 3 out of the 5 labs, 60%, did not fail any of the criteria. 2 AMS labs failed the systematic bias criterion, but the other 21 failures came out from the other 33 labs. And this is correct. Here's the paper that Hugh deliberately omitted and didn't tell you about. If you want the full context, you got to look at everything, right? But Hugh deliberately didn't and failed to mention stages 1 and 2 of this program. Now, if I wanted to play Hugh's game, I could press him, because stage 2 is where we look at cellulose, which is most relevant to the Shroud of Turin, which is a linen cloth made of cellulose, right? But Hugh doesn't even mention these results at all. Now, I'm going to be fair and get over, sticking it to Hugh a little bit. That's a little fun, but there's a reason for that. It's because he's talking about the New Scientist magazine, which I think is in context clearly talking about report number 3 or stage 3 that they talk about, right? So here's the stage 2 results. You can see with cellulose, here was the results. And there are interesting problems that they found throughout the for the tests, where they tested how AMS and other carbon-14 laboratories worked on the cellulose sample. Just showing it. Here's the report that Hugh mentions for stage 3, right? And as he says, look, in total, 23 of the 30 laboratories in this stage all failed to meet the 3 basic criteria for an adequate performance in the production of carbon-14 results. This is clearly unsatisfactory, right? And this is disproving carbon-14 dating as a whole, not just AMS, but carbon-14 as a whole, any method, right? Here's the 3 stages. Here are the labs that took place in each of the stages. So you can see there was 8 AMS carbon-14 labs, which were failing in stage 1, and 5 in both stages 2 and 3, which came out as dismal failures. Now, where does Hugh get this 60% from? Is he just pulling that out of his rumps? No. So table 3, I believe he says. Here it is, right? So AMS labs. So here are the 3 criteria: internal error or internal consistency, external error. So internal just means like, maybe they have the wrong date, but do they at least get the wrong date consistently, kind of thing? Do they get the same date over and over again, even if it's an error in reality or not? Okay, the AMS labs, and as we'll see, constantly they are internally consistent. That's not a problem. Also, surprisingly, in this study, they're saying there was no external error problem, multiplier problem either. But 2 of the AMS labs were proven to have systematic bias issues. 2 divided by 5, 40%. Just out of 5 labs, that is whoppingly big. That means, when they carbon-14 dated the Shroud in 1988, they didn't even have 5 labs. They had 3. So that means statistically, we would expect 2 out of the 3 labs to screw up and have the wrong date if we're just going by percentages, right? And frankly, because they only had 3 AMS labs dating carbon-14 dating the Shroud, it's very, very likely that all 3 labs had a systematic bias. I mean, that is easily accomplishable, right? And that's why originally the credible STIRP scientists in their proposal wanted to have 7 labs, even more than 5 AMS labs in this study. They wanted to have 7, at least so they could make this some kind of have better statistical odds of that. Well, at least one of the laboratories wouldn't have a systematic bias or something like that. But, just thinking about, Hugh is pretending that like having a 60% success rate where no systematic bias is present is, 3 out of 5 is not good. I'm sorry, that's not good. That raises immense doubts for me that, in 1988, when they only had 3, not even 5, but just 3 labs, the odds are all 3 of them had a systematic bias. I mean, there's nothing preventing that. Hugh also quotes this bit right here. In total, only 15 of the 38 laboratories met all 3 of these adequacy requirements. Again, this is terrible for carbon-14 in general. It's clearly showing there's a problem. This is not something that speaks well for the general reliability of carbon-14 dating. Now, Hugh conveniently only reports on the results from stage 3, which had nothing to do with cellulose carbon dating at all. And I think when we understand the results from stage 1, 2, and 3, I think this is what helps to explain Murdoch Baxter's quotes in New Scientist magazine, where he's saying AMS it was pitiful. It was worse than everything else. So number 1, we have Hugh's explanation where somehow he's a mind reader. He can read Baxter's thoughts and go, yeah, this carbon-14 scientist, he lied, or he's just an idiot. He doesn't know the results of his own study. And so he got the details wrong because he was clearly disgruntled. No proof. Hugh just makes that up. You'll never see the words Murdoch Baxter is clearly disgruntled in New Scientist magazine. You won't see that Murdoch Baxter is clearly disgruntled in the peer-reviewed papers in Radiocarbon, that in the reports that I was showing you guys. Hugh is making that up. But there are other explanations that make more sense. Maybe his comments are in the context of his overall sense from all 3 of the stages and looking at how AMS performed. Or an even better explanation, even if he is just looking at stage 3 results and reporting in context about that, it's not the quantity, it's the quality, the qualitative criteria. How well. So 3 out of 5 AMS labs fulfilled the criteria, but qualitatively, how well did the AMS labs fulfill the criteria? Murdoch Baxter is not talking in terms of a simple pass-fail here. His quotes saying that the AMS labs sucked worse than everything else and were horrible were probably based on qualitative assessments, because remember, I quoted him as saying the AMS labs, they were horrible. They were so bad. They were way out. When they make a mistake, they really make a mistake, even with dating samples as young as 200 years old. The conventional labs are way better. They don't, at least when they make a mistake, they're not as bad of a mistake as the AMS labs are. And I think personally that is how we explain what Murdoch Baxter is saying. That makes sense in context, in full context of all 3 stages of this study, intercomparison study, and of Murdoch Baxter's quotes, which I believe, New Scientist magazine was quoting this scientist correctly. Even Hugh admits that. He doesn't say they misquoted Murdoch Baxter. There's no story of Dr. Murdoch Baxter saying, hey, you misquoted me. I never said that. What are you talking about? No, Murdoch Baxter, the organizer of this trial, said what I said he said. And even Hugh has to admit that. The only question is, how do we explain that? Do we believe the BS, a high school teacher who's biased and a Shroud's skeptic and desperate to believe in the carbon-14 no matter what, who just somehow can mind read Murdoch Baxter and say, well, he was clearly disgruntled. That's why he, said stuff that wasn't really true. Do you believe that? Or do you believe me, where at least what I'm saying comes from the article, comes from quotes Murdoch Baxter said, where it's more reasonable to believe, I think he's thinking qualitatively. He's saying the AMS is so bad, not because, quantitatively there was only, it had a 60% success rate with respect to the 3 criteria, which is higher than the other labs. I wonder what that percentage would have been. Let's say we had a comparable number, right? Because let me bring up the paper again and just show you the numbers. Okay, so 7 liquid scintillation, 10, 16. We had about 16, it looks like, from these results here. Okay, imagine we tested 16 AMS labs. I wonder how many of them would then show. Would we get a 60% or would it be much lower? Who knows? We just don't know based on this test. But again, 5 labs compared to testing 16, or compared to 12 plus 3, 15. Clearly, there were a lot more labs and therefore a lot more potential for failures compared to just testing 5 measly little AMS labs and that sort of thing. And actually that's, okay, so here are the actual numbers. 20 gas, 13 scintillation in stage 2, 18 gas, carbon-14, and LSC, there was 14, 20, 28. So you can see the number of AMS labs, the number of opportunities for error is much, much lower. And the fact that it has a 40% failure rate with just 5 little labs that's a lot of reasonable doubt, right? And what's worse is that when they screw up, man, they really screw up. These labs, they get it wrong, but it's no big deal. It's a minor thing, perhaps. But the AMS labs, according to Dr. Murdoch Baxter, and what I think is his reasoning for singling the AMS labs out for being unreasonable compared to the others, is due to the qualitative assessment that he makes. That sounds like a reasonable explanation for his comments that I quoted, right? And when he's saying Baxter says some of the accelerator laboratories were way out when dating samples as little as 200 years old. And that's why Baxter says the accelerator mass spectrometry used last year to date the Shroud came out of the survey badly. So he's not cheating like Hugh and just doing a mindless quantitative assessment by the numbers, just saying, well, what's the number of failures versus successes relative to the number of labs that they've had? Well, only 2 labs of the 5 AMS labs failed. That's, 40%, or you might, in other terms, that's a 60% success rate. And that is higher than the number of labs that failed to meet 1 or more of the 3 criteria from the other types of labs. But of course, you have more opportunities for failure. Hugh doesn't take account of this at all in what he's saying. He's doing this straightforward, simplistic thing to, try to contradict what the actual expert who conducted the study himself, high school science teacher with a Shroud skeptical bias, desperate to believe the carbon-14 dating, no matter what the problems, Dr. Murdoch Baxter, doctor, with Hugh, no doctor, Dr. Murdoch Baxter, a carbon-14 scientist who published the peer-reviewed results in Radiocarbon magazine. And let me just bring that up again just to prove, look whose name is at the top of these papers, Murdoch Baxter. I don't see Hugh Farey here. Where's Hugh Farey. No, he wasn't a part of this study. He didn't publish these papers. He's just reading the paper and making assumptions, whereas Murdoch Baxter was involved in the study itself. I believe him, not you, Shroud Skeptic. I'm sorry. If Dr. Murdoch Baxter has been quoted, and even according to Hugh, he's been quoted properly as saying the AMS labs were horrible in terms of this study and compared to the other types of carbon-14 dating techniques, I believe him and not Hugh Farey. Again, I'm going to include both of these papers on my blog kind of thing, and you can read them. Again, Hugh, technically speaking, what Hugh says in his blog is correct. He is quoting from this report, and the data he's supporting and the quotes that he's giving are correct. They're in here. I found every single one of them, and he quotes them properly. And he's correct that, yeah, the AMS labs, if you look at stage 1 and stage 2, that report, let's look at the conclusions for that actually, right? Or is that, no, that's not here. Okay. Yes. Second, okay, first, it is clear that at each stage and for each laboratory type, there are outlying laboratories. The analysis presented here has not removed the data for any of these laboratories. Okay, so that's a technical thing, doesn't matter. Second, results show clearly that laboratories are remarkably consistent internally, right? That internal consistent. So let's say they date, they carbon date. This isn't accurate, but just for the sake of argument, let's say they carbon date, the Statue of Liberty or something like that. You can't carbon date the Statue of Liberty. I understand that. I'm just saying, right? And they get a date of 500 AD. Well, that's clearly wrong. We know when the Statue of Liberty was constructed. It wasn't constructed 500 AD. But the results of this study would show that, well, hey, all of the carbon-14 results, that at least they're consistent. They all get 500 AD, even though it's wrong. That's what this is saying. The differences between the duplicates generally agree with the laboratory's claimed precision. So this is not really a good criteria. Third, the study indicates, here it is, systematic biases. These are the conclusions for stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 2 included tests on cellulose, remember? Systematic biases amongst the laboratories, and that there seem to be problems in calibrating to a common standard. So you can see there are things in here that when you take into account specific details from stage 1, 2, and 3 could make sense of why Murdoch Baxter is making this overall assessment that the AMS labs are really came out badly in this series of intercomparison tests, right? You can see it has a wide, here's on the cellulose. Oh my gosh, look at that wide range, 1900. It's the worst on cellulose. That's interesting, very, very interesting. The results of the labs, the range of error of dates that they got, 1900-year date range. That's like dating Jesus to 1900 AD. Look, read these papers for yourself for all the technical details. The main point here about Hugh and what he said about me in the blog is, here's the main point that you take away, right? He denies Murdoch Baxter, the world's expert, right? When I quoted him from New Scientist magazine saying the following, saying that Baxter says the accelerator mass spectrometry came out of the survey badly. Baxter says that some of the AMS laboratories were way out when dating samples as little as 200 years old. Why? Because so little material is used in AMS carbon-14 dating. The effects of chemical pretreatment are likely to be way more serious, says Baxter. That makes more sense in light of what I'm saying here, right? He's assessing the AMS labs to be garbage and rubbish from a qualitative standpoint. How wrong were they? When they were wrong, how wrong were they? How bad were they in terms of actually dating? And having this systematic bias affecting their results. Whereas with the other labs, they were a lot more stable. They weren't, when they were wrong, technically speaking, more often. Is that statistically relevant? No, because only 5 AMS labs participated, whereas dozens of labs, other carbon-14 labs, participated. Therefore, there's more opportunity for error, right? If you test 20 labs, the odds are you're going to have like 5 divided by 20 or something like that. There's more opportunities for error is what I'm getting at. So you can't just do this simplistic quantitative comparison like Hugh Farey's doing and think that proves anything. Well, only 2 labs made mistake. AMS labs, 2 out of 5 labs made mistakes or had systematic bias errors. But look at the other techniques. They had a lot more error, labs making errors based on the 3 criteria, failing to fulfill 1 or more of these 3 criteria. Therefore, I can say the AMS did better. No, it's not as simplistic as that. And I think that makes more sense of why Baxter is saying what he's saying here. Or you could just believe Hugh, again, the high school science teacher who is a devout Shroud skeptic, dedicated to believing the carbon-14 no matter what, who somehow psychologically gets into Baxter's head and says, well, he was clearly disgruntled, so never mind what he said. It's all BS. He didn't really mean it. He was just upset because his lab didn't perform so well. Where did you get that, Hugh? You made that up out of whole cloth. All right, so that's it for the first critique of Hugh Farey. Let's get to the next test then. Second thing, Hugh goes out of order here. He skips over the 2004 thing and addresses that last. But his second of the 3 points, he addresses this second intercomparison test that I mentioned, known as the Trondheim report, done in 1983 by 5 AMS labs. And they showed the results that all 5 of the labs got the ages wrong by half the known age or more in a total out of 7 out of 17 experiments. Hugh Farey says this is all lies, this is not true, and I'm just making these numbers up. So let's go to Hugh's critique and see what he says about this. The second interlaboratory comparison mentioned, although it actually took place a few years earlier, is an intercomparison of some AMS and small gas counter laboratories by Richard Burleigh, published in 1986. Contrary to Glover's statement that 5 AMS labs took part, there were in fact 4 AMS and 2 small gas counter labs. Further, 18 dates are reported, not 17 as Glover says. Okay, so full stop. I confirmed through my source what happened here. So first of all, Hugh is correct. Okay, so let me bring up the peer-reviewed paper from Burleigh. Here it is, an intercomparison test, and go down to the results. Table 1, results. Here are the dates that they got for each of the 3 samples, and if you count this up, it's 18, not 17. So it looks like my source, because I was quoting world-renowned Shroud expert and lawyer Mark Antonacci, page 299 to page 300 of his book, which I will read a portion of word for word, just so Hugh can't attribute any lies to me, but I will read what this world's expert has to say, who clearly has read the peer-reviewed paper, just as I have now. But Hugh is correct that there are 18 results, and it is true that there are 4 AMS labs involved. Where does it say that in the abstract? The performance of the 6 laboratories, 4 AMS and 2 gas counter laboratories. So Hugh's correct on that minor detail. Who cares? It's an innocent slip. What happened is, the reason I thought it was 5 is because I was, Mark Antonacci in his book switches between mentioning 5 and 6 based on, so if you look at when he's talking about the Trondheim report, he breaks it up and says that, talks about 5 labs and problems with the 5 labs that did the dating, because 5 of the 6 laboratories correctly dated the first sample. But Zurich, one of the labs that dated the Shroud, was approximately 1,000 years too young on its date. And then he proceeds to speak about the 5 labs. So when I quoted this back in 2018 for my debate with Alan, I must have just gotten that confused when he was talking about 5 labs. So I assumed 5 labs total did the dating. I didn't realize he was specifying a subset of the total 6 and saying, well, look, Zurich was a bunch of bunk, but there are problems even with the 5 out of the 6 labs that got a correct date. And he goes into the problems there or something like that. So great, minor little thing. That's not a lie. That's just a minor mistake. And I got that wrong from my time when I prepared for, within having a week and a half or less to prepare for a debate with Alan on 5 topics. This was my first Shroud debate. This was when I first converted back in November. I converted in May of 2018, and I started doing my podcast in July of 2018. And this was my first real professional debate on the Shroud against a guy named Alan. In fact, I didn't even know Hugh back then. And I had to rush to prepare for that debate. And okay, so on this topic, on topics where, I felt were more just kind of minor things to just mention as causing reasonable doubts, I listed the quotes as I could get them. And here is that document, right? This is literally the document, and I haven't changed anything with the exception of adding a link or source or something like that. But these are literally the notes I prepared for this section of the debate back in 2018. And you'll see the quotes. Where's the Murdoch Baxter, New Scientist, the 2004 thing. Here's on the Trondheim down here, right? So I'm just getting it from that. And I copied and pasted it into my blogs without looking into the peer-reviewed sources themselves. I trust principle of testimony. I trust the experts who have done the research and have been in the game for decades back then. And so I've copied that unless and until I learned there's a problem. Now that Hugh has said that, that's why I've gone into the actual primary documents themselves to confirm or deny what Hugh is saying. And on this minor little point, he was correct. Who cares? Irrelevant. It doesn't matter at all, really. It's just a technicality. It doesn't affect my main point about the intercomparison test here, utterly destroying the reliability of believing the AMS labs could carbon date the Shroud reliably back in 1988. So let's continue on with Hugh's more substantive attack as he continues. Where is it? The first set of results was inconsistent with the historically derived date of the sample, but consistent within itself. So it's internally consistent. Again, who cares? I don't care. If it's not representing external consistency, actually dating the sample correctly, I don't really care. If it's you get the right date, but you're consistently wrong. Sorry, you get the same dates, but they're consistently wrong. It's irrelevant. It's not good. Internal consistency is not good enough. That's why it was only one of 3 criteria in the previous intercomparison test we looked at. The other results concurred with the historically understood dates. Glover's statement that all 5 labs got the ages wrong by half the known age or more in a total of 7 out of 17 experiments is untrue, unjustified, and deliberately ascribing a mens rea to me. I deliberately misled people with my interpretation of the results. So first of all, that's not true. I confirmed my source is Mark Antonacci, and I confirmed again, page 299 to 300 of his book, it says this. Let me quote it. So here's my source. So this proves that I'm not lying. And we'll go to whether or not Mark Antonacci was lying in a moment. Okay, quote unquote, the original samples that were mailed by the British Museum in 1983 were dated a total of 11 times by the 6 participating laboratories. Stunningly, 6 of 11 samples appear to have been carbon dated incorrectly. They sucked. They got it wrong by half or more of their actual or historical age. That is pathetic. And you believe in carbon dating? he goes on. Here's the quote that matters. And this is the only thing I quoted, right? All three samples were dated a total of 17 times by the 6 participating laboratories. Incredibly, 41% of these samples, 7 of 17, appear to have been dated incorrectly by half or more of their actual or historical age. That's page 299, the bottom paragraph. You don't dare say that I'm lying, Hugh. You scumbag, saying I'm deliberately misleading. How dare you say such a thing? Okay, so now, is it true? I was truthful in quoting Mark Antonacci. But as we saw, well, look, Mark Antonacci was clearly wrong. When we've now looked at the peer-reviewed source, I counted them with my own eyeballs just to make sure Hugh can't accuse me of lying again with his dishonest tactics. Hugh's right. There are 18, right? Here it is. Table 1. Here are the results they got. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Great. So Mark Antonacci miscounted in his book. It's a typo. It's an error. It's irrelevant, Hugh. There are a total of 18 samples. But Hugh says this is untrue, unjustified. It's deliberately misleading. Is it? Let's take a look at that table again. I tried to ask, it's not in the paper, right? Nowhere does it say 7 out of 18 results are wrong by more than half the known age. That's not in the conclusions. In fact, the conclusions, if you read the conclusions, which we will scroll down to, as Hugh quotes at least one of them, I think, the conclusions would hint at the opposite. So is Mark Antonacci, is my source, lying here? No. Look at more. So here's the Peruvian sample, dates to 1000 to 1400. Okay, you've got a date of 460. That's a date that is wrong by more than half the known age, right? 500 AD at best would be thing. And if it dates to around 1400 AD, okay, maybe Mark Antonacci, I don't know how Mark counted the 7 results, but maybe included these results kind of thing, right? And you can definitely get up to 7 easily. 1, 2, 3, 4, depending on what you're including. 1200 AD. Oh, you got a date of 80 AD? Well, that's more than half the known age, right? It's more than 600 years off. 300 AD is more than 600 years off from 1200, right? 1200 minus 300. This is 900 years in error. This is even worse. 450. This is wrong, more than half wrong. This is more than half the known age. All of these dates, right? 600 AD would be half the known age. You would be 600 years off. All of these dates, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So Mark Antonacci has counted 5 here. And at the very least, even if we count this 1000 AD, okay, so this is off. So 6, this is 500 AD would be half the known age of the 1000 AD. I'm helping out the Shroud skeptics here. Okay, so this would be off. So you would have 5. Now, are there 2 in here that Mark Antonacci is counting as less than half the known age, right? So on this front, I think, I don't know how Mark Antonacci did his countings to get 7, but I think what his thinking is that if half of 3,000 is 1,500. Okay, so, oh, great. So 4,517. Well, that's more than 1,500 years off. And so he counts that. So that's 6. And I don't know where he gets the 7th one. Again, with this side of the table, I'm just speculating as to what happened. But it's clear that Mark Antonacci has seen this paper, he's seen this table, and he did some counting. And he's correct. Look at all these dates that are way off, way off, just like the Shroud of Turin by 1,000 years or more in certain cases. This case, 1,300 years off, 1,350 years off, 1,230 years off, right? 4,230 minus 3,000 is 1,230. Way off. That would account for the Shroud being in 30 AD and getting a date 1,300 years into the future. Look at all these dates. The best they have is 3440, 440 years wrong. And you want to point to this as a good result, Hugh? You're insane. And actually, update, edit, I did finally discover where Mark Antonacci was correct. It is 7. And it has nothing to do with the mistake of understanding on this side. So Mark Antonacci does not count any of the Egyptian sample number 1 as the mistake being half or more of the known age. Now, again, look, this is 1,517 years off. 4,517 BC is the wrong date. It's over 1,500 years wrong because we know this sample dated to 3,000 BC. The best that these carbon-14 labs were able to do was get the date of 3,440 years BC, meaning 440 years off. Pathetic. But Mark, being the conservative, careful scholar that he is, who just made a mistake and innocently counted 17 and missed 18, and Hugh wants to say that's a lie. You are disgusting. How dare you call Mark Antonacci a liar over that and deliberately deceiving? Nuts. Jeez. The bias with Shroud skeptics. But I figured out, right? So there are 5 dates here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All of these dates with sample number 2 are off by more than 600 years, which is half the known age, because it dates to 1200 AD, 80 AD, 530. But there are 2 dates here. So this is what I think, and I didn't speak to Mark because he's very busy right now. So this one is off, right? So if it dates to 1000 AD, well, half the known age would be 500 AD, right? Well, this 460 AD is less than 500 AD. So it is off by more than half the known age. But what I think that Mark counted this date too, 600 AD, because the Peruvian sample has a range. We don't know that it dates to 1000 AD. It dates sometime between 1000 and 1400 AD. We're not exactly sure. And so I think what he did is he said, well, there's 6 results that are off by more than half the known age, proving these carbon-14 methods suck. So I think what Mark has done here is he said, well, because there's this range, let's go straight in the middle. Let's assume this Peruvian sample dates to 1200 AD, right? Right smack dab in the middle of 1000 and 1400. The middle number would be 1200 AD. So he said, let's just assume that is the date, the actual date for this Peruvian sample. Well, in that case, you have 2 samples because half the age of 1200 is 600 AD. And there are 2 results that are 600 AD or earlier. So therefore, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 from sample 2 and 1, 2 from sample 3 got dates of more than half or more the known age of the samples. And that's how Mark Antonacci counted up to 7 out of 17. He messed up. It should be 7 divided by 18. 7 out of 18. That is pathetic. Hugh, you dare to brag about that? Are you nuts? So yeah, if we go with Mark Antonacci originally did 7 divided by 17, and he said, look, 41% of all the labs failed miserably to get the results. They got the wrong results, carbon-14 dates, by half or more the known age of the objects. And that's not even including all of the dates they got that were just way off, but they were less than half the known age, such as saying being 1,500 years off, when half the known age would be 2,500, right? Because the Egyptian sample, 3,000 BC, means the sample is 5,000 years old. 3,000 BC plus 2,000 AD equals 5,000 years. And if you're off by 1,500 years, well, that's not half the known age, but that's a whopping big number. You're over a millennia and a half wrong. So these carbon-14 dating techniques suck. You're a fool if you believe in their results based on these intercomparison tests. Man, that's pathetic. And Hugh wants to say, well, technically speaking, Mark lied because the failure rate wasn't 41%. It wasn't 7 divided by 17. Mark Antonacci missed one, so it should be 7 divided by 18. You see, they only had a 38% failure rate, whereas failure is defined as having the dates wrong by half or more the known age of the sample. That is disgustingly horrible. You would be laughed at if you came in with empirical results like that, thinking you had good science. No, this absolutely proves I was correct, and I am owed an apology by Hugh Farey for lying and saying that I'm deliberately deceiving in terms of the quote that I gave Oakwood. Yes, I got the number of labs wrong. It was 6 labs, not 5. I explained why I messed that up. And it appears I trusted Mark Antonacci, and he miscounted. He counted 17 results instead of 18. Who cares? That doesn't make us liars. It doesn't affect the substantive point we're raising, whereby these labs are horrible in terms of carbon dating. I was right. Hugh's wrong. And Hugh should feel, a little ashamed right now, I would say. He's been exposed. Okay, yeah, so here's the part where I'm going to quote Mark Antonacci, because Hugh's going to pretend, if we look at what the conclusions are, right, of this paper. Here's the peer-reviewed paper in Radiocarbon magazine. Okay, 1, overall, there is good agreement between the results obtained and the expected historical dating of the samples, in particular as far as samples 1 and 3 are concerned. Notice, so what happened is they dated, in this test, they carbon dated 2 samples originally. And on the second sample, they screwed up big time. All of the labs way, way, way off. So they cheated. Years later, I think 3 years later, if I'm not mistaken, they added a 3rd sample to the mix to see if they could fudge the data. Oh, forget about the second sample. Oh, don't worry about that. Yeah, we screwed up on that. Forget about that. Just look at samples 1 and 3, and they got less wild results with samples 1 and 3. But as we saw from the results, they're still way off, thousands of years off. It's not overall. There's a good agreement between the results obtained and the expected dating samples, I would argue. But this is the peer-reviewed conclusions from the carbon-14 scientists. Hugh quotes that one. But there are others. There do not appear to be differences between the AMS and small counter techniques, although, as stated in the results section above, it was not possible to test this fully. So you couldn't tell whether the AMS labs versus others were better. 3, a coherent series of results can be obtained when several laboratories undertake separate blindfold measurements of the same sample. 4, as expected, there are no special difficulties in dating textiles by carbon-14 using small sample techniques as the concordance of blah, 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 right? So this conclusion is apparently going against what the pro-Shroud side is saying, what I was saying in my slide, that, well, dating textiles like the Shroud, AMS carbon-14 dating and carbon-14 in general, it struggles with dating textiles. In this study, they're saying, no, that's not the case. And finally, the distribution of results containing, as it does, 2 outliers. There were 2 majorly off outliers. Lends added emphasis to the need for the dating of any important relic, such as the Shroud of Turin, to be shared by several laboratories. Not just pitiful 3 laboratories, but by several, like 7, the number the credible STIRP scientists, the original proposal, had in mind, perhaps. And they should do this simultaneously if the results are to have maximum credibility. Interesting. So this is saying unless you have several laboratories, you're not going to have maximum credibility if you use these techniques to date the Shroud of Turin in particular. This is interesting support for the pro-Shroud side that Hugh deliberately withheld from you in his blog. He lied. He created the false perception, right? But what about these conclusions that seem to go against, especially one that seems to go against what we want to hear on the pro-Shroud side? Okay, here's a quotation from Mark Antonacci, Hugh, who's clearly done the research into this. All 5 of these laboratories erroneously dated this first sample at approximately half of its historical age. Yet this systematic error on the part of all the laboratories was hardly discussed or analyzed in the report. It was ignored in order to come to these conclusions, in other words. Mark Antonacci goes on. Instead, the report states that the second sample was simply replaced because its 5 radiocarbon dates, quote unquote, suggested that the material was of much more recent date than expected. Let me just, so I'm not accused of misquoting, let's see if that much more. Here's the quote. First, the results sample 2 suggested that the material was of much more recent date than expected. So Mark Antonacci is quoting correctly here. Great, grand, and groovy. So far, Mark's doing some good work here. Let's see what else he has to say. Instead, the report states that the second sample was simply replaced because its 5 radiocarbon dates suggested that the material was of much more recent date than expected. Incredibly, the very next sentence states this was probably erroneous as it turned out. In other words, all 5 laboratories' dating results for sample 2 were probably erroneous. Unfortunately, these results were both a prelude to and a precedent for what would occur only 2 years later in 1988. 3 radiocarbon dating laboratories, not several, but only 3, correctly dated some control samples, but all 3 participating laboratories would date the Shroud centuries younger than its actual or historical age. The report does not state when the British Museum or the radiocarbon laboratories even realized their systematic mistake with the second sample. What is clear, however, is that the report was published 3 years after the second sample was mailed to the laboratories. Yet it does not indicate that any investigation was undertaken at all by the British Museum or any of the participating laboratories. The second sample was simply replaced by a third sample and was hoped that nobody would notice. This cavalier attitude with the second sample stands in contrast to the treatment given to the Zurich laboratory, which also dated the third sample incorrectly by thousands of years, this time being too old, while the other 5 labs correctly dated the third sample. In Zurich's case, an investigation was undertaken, in which a number of follow-up tests and measurements were performed at the Swiss lab using their new and normal pre-treatment cleaning methods. These subsequent tests supported the report's conclusion that Zurich's 2 1,000-year-plus mistaken dates, quote-unquote, must have been due to contamination introduced by a new method of pre-treatment. Zurich's dating errors were not even included in the report's final statistical analysis. So here's the quote that I gave before, and he's responding to that, right? Incredibly, 41% of these samples, 7 of 17, appear to have been dated incorrectly by half or more of their actual or historical age. In spite of these results, the report laughably concludes that, quote unquote, overall, there is good agreement between the results obtained and the expected historical dating of the samples in particular, as far as samples 1 and 3 are concerned. However, this is just another way of saying that although the labs were in good agreement for sample 2, the results were not in agreement with its actual or historical age. The report also concludes that a coherent series of results can be obtained when several laboratories undertake separate blindfold measurements of the same sample. Yet the results from the second sample showed that all the dating laboratories can mistakenly date a sample even when it is dated by 5 laboratories. This is why 3 labs is nowhere near good enough. You need at least 7 or more, I would argue, before you could even trust anything from these guys. Going on, these conclusions actually indicate how unsure the labs and their coordinator were about their accuracy, yet how anxious they were to go ahead and date the Shroud regardless. But let's see what Jordan has to say, because he kind of backs me up. And this is a Shroud skeptic who Hugh fully supports.
So this cleaning procedure is particularly important for textiles. Like, you do it for everything, but it's especially important for textiles because of their nature. They tend to incorporate dirt and stuff. And this is where it's important to remember that radiocarbon dating has come a long way in the 50 years since this dating was done for the Shroud, right? And in fact, in the 80s, when this was done, a major contributor to poor quality results was contamination. So shortly after this dating was done, so this was done in 1988, and I think reported in 1989, right, in Nature. In 1990, so the next year, there was an international comparison where they got a bunch of labs together and they tested samples to kind of see how this was going. And 5 of those labs were AMS laboratories, AMS being the type of carbon dating that they did for this, again, see episode 1. Right. So in that trial, they found that there were major sources of variability for the 5 AMS labs. And that the source of variability was cleaning procedures, was contamination. Different cleaning procedures led to variations between AMS labs in the 80s. This was a recognized problem that they've gotten much better with it now, but obviously this was before they had improved that.
That seems like we should say that one more time, because that seems pretty important.
Yeah.
Particularly since our test was done in the late 80s.
Right.
In one of these AMS labs.
Right. So at the time this dating was done, at that time, it's not like the tests were completely unreliable, but one of the major source of variability when you had all a bunch of labs test the same sample, the major source of variability between those labs, which are the same labs doing this test for the Shroud of Turin, was different cleaning procedures leading to variations between the labs.
Okay, so there it is. This is a Shroud skeptic. He's an atheist. He has training in nuclear engineering, formal education as a nuclear engineer and that sort of thing. And so a smart cookie, right? And someone I have respect for because he will go to the primary literature and that sort of thing as well. And he is backing me up here, right? That there is this fundamental problem. And what the studies in the 1980s showed is, okay, there is this variability and they're way off. The AMS labs would be way off. And he's saying that it was totally linked to the differing cleaning procedures between the labs. As we come to Lloyd Curry, I'm going to agree with him, but I'm going to argue that there are other things that would make these results way off as well, in addition. And that's going to get into my third quote with Dr. Lloyd Curry here. Okay, so let's go to the final objection. And this is my quote about Lloyd Curry. So let me just play that part again, because Hugh's got a bunch of quotes within quotes and a bunch of stuff. So I want to make it simple. Let me play what I said for Oakwood about Dr. Lloyd Curry in this 2004 paper.
Late as is 2004, there was a peer-reviewed journal in which one of the most famous carbon-14 scientists in the world, Dr. Lloyd Curry, he said, with respect to dating the Shroud in particular, quote unquote, a wave of questioning has followed of possible artifacts that could have affected the carbon-14 result. The question of non-contemporaneous organic matter artificially adding to the carbon-14 content and therefore making the Shroud date younger than it should, the medieval period instead of first century, that came from oil, wax, tallow, smoke, and bacterial attack. The effects of such can be very serious and complex a matter in relation to the Shroud, and therefore is deserving of new quantitative investigation for the possible impacts on measurement accuracy. Again, this is not some Christian pro-Shroud guy. This is Dr. Lloyd Curry, one of the most famous carbon-14 scientists in the world, who's saying this.
So that's the clip from carbon-14 scientist Dr. Lloyd Curry. And Hugh, again, is viciously attacking me, saying I lied, I invented this quote, it's all made up. So what is the supposed problem with what I said about Dr. Lloyd Curry? I was honestly scratching my head at how Hugh thought this was a misquotation, and I didn't really understand what he was trying to say. So That said, because this is, I would do the exact same thing. I wouldn't change anything on this quote at all. At least with the other quotes. Okay, I said 7 out of 17. 7 out of 17. Well, that's a mistake. I should say 18. Or I said 5 labs instead of 6 labs. Like, okay, I'll fix that going forward, kind of thing. Now that I know, minor little mistakes like that. But with this, I would literally put the same quote in word for word without a problem. And here, so let's say here's Hugh. Here's his problem with this Lloyd Curry quote. Compare this to Glover's misquotation. A wave of questioning is followed, omission of possible artifacts that could have been affected. Carbon-14 result, the question of non-contemporaneous organic matter. And then I have in brackets here, which is fine, doesn't distort anything, artificially adding to the carbon-14 content in that area or cloth as a whole. Yeah, that's correct. That's helping to explain what we're talking about, right? The question of non-contemporaneous organic matter, which would add to the carbon-14 content in the shroud and give us a false date. That's called the bioplastic coating hypothesis. There is a hypothesis about this to explain why the carbon-14 was off. So I'm just adding, and it's in brackets. I double checked. Did I forget brackets or anything? No, there's brackets in what I said right here. So, I mean, it's not like I'm pretending this is a part of the quote or something, or not even as a mistake. There's literally no problem here, and it doesn't distort. It explains exactly what he's talking about. Hugh lied about this. And same with the other thing. Let's again go on to see what Hugh said. And is deserving of new quantitative investigation of the possible impacts on measurement accuracy of the 1988 results. Hugh lied. I have brackets here, meaning that this isn't a part of the original quote. It's me just clarifying measurement accuracy of what? Of the 1988 results. So here I am going out of my way to clarify that Dr. Lloyd Curry is not slamming AMS carbon-14 in general in all cases. He's talking about the carbon-14 dating of the AMS carbon-14 dating done on the Shroud in particular. And I write that in the thing and I say it in the show. And why is that relevant? Because the general argument is that the AMS carbon-14 dating technique was known to be unreliable for dating linen textiles like the Shroud that were comparable to the Shroud, had similar problems like the Shroud. So quoting a thing about the Shroud in particular is relevant. So there's literally no lie. I would literally put this word for word back up, even after hearing Hugh's complaints, because his complaints are just BS. They don't make any sense. This doesn't distort the meaning. It explains the meaning perfectly. It's in brackets. At first, when I saw Hugh saying I misquoted, I thought maybe he was saying I forgot to put brackets in, and I was pretending that this was part of the original quote, as well as this as part of the original quote. If anything, Hugh lied about, Hugh misquoted me because I have brackets here, right? And up in his blog, he doesn't include brackets here. So he's lying about me. He's saying I said something I didn't, apparently. So this is just a whole bunch of stupid foolishness on the part of Hugh Farey in lying and pretending that I distorted the truth with this quote. Now, there is one other thing that I've avoided that is possibly this omission. What on earth is he talking about? Well, he's talking about, so I omitted, first of all, Lloyd Curry's quote, as I'll show you in the actual peer-reviewed paper itself, and quote in full, unlike what Hugh Farey manipulatively does and selects stuff, right? But I omitted 2 of the 3 possible hypotheses. I only mentioned the 3rd proposal that Lloyd Curry talks about the non-contemporaneous organic matter, blah, 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 blah. But there's also, this is the most important thing. And I think this is again, I have no idea, but I think this is what is most serious, why the person who asked me, the fan who requested that I address this part, I think this is what they find most problematic. Like, not of the AMS method. A wave of questioning is followed, not of the AMS method, but of possible artifacts, blah, 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 right? So Hugh is trying to strawman me into trying to say something I didn't say, where number one, I'm leaving out the AMS. I'm trying to argue that the AMS method is generally unreliable and that Lloyd Curry is agreeing with that. So number one, why did I omit this? Was this something that was deliberate on my end in the first place? No. So number one, it wasn't deliberate. And I tracked down my source. Again, here, unedited, okay, since 2018, here's the Lloyd Curry thing right here. So this is the quote as I wrote it down back in 2018. Back in 2018, I was just reading Mark Antonacci's book and writing down the quotes that I got. Or in this case, it was Ian Wilson, page 140 of Ian Wilson's book on the Shroud of Turin. And I copied down, what he said. And here's the quote as I copied it down. Completely unaltered from 2018. Back then, I was just making the point. My argument was against carbon-14 as a whole. I wasn't distinguishing between AMS or anything like that. And I think because of that, here's where I made the error. Basically, right here, I should have put in 3 dots or something like that. But instead, because I wasn't interested in the AMS part when I was writing it down, I think, trying to remember my mindset 2018, I know for a fact my goal was just in this part of the debate, just to raise questions about the carbon-14 itself. In fact, that's how I met Hugh, right? He came into my comments in response to this debate that I did with Alan. And so he heard me then. He didn't write a blog that I was such a liar back then and all this stuff, right? So I had no idea. When I make my future slides, I usually copy and paste from, this was my original source. I would copy and paste that into a slide, then copy and paste, so on and so forth. And that's why my quotation comes out this way. But in terms of that omitted bit about not of the AMS method itself, but of possible artifacts, it was just an innocent omission because I didn't think it was relevant back in 2018. And then unwittingly on my part, I'm just copying and pasting this whole time. I didn't even know as of now, when I was copying it into this slide, I didn't even know that the quote said not of the AMS method because I wasn't looking at the original quote in Ian Wilson's book or anything. I didn't care or know about this. But is this a problem? I would still leave it out. This omission is irrelevant because I was totally crystal clear that I'm quoting Lloyd Curry here, not to disprove AMS in general, but to disprove AMS in its relation to dating linen textiles like the Shroud. And I said its relation to the Shroud in particular, which is, Hugh Farey admits, in context, is what Lloyd Curry is saying. That said, let's go to the actual peer review and quote in full context, because Hugh Farey has really kicked himself in the gonads here, because actually when you quote Lloyd Curry in full, not like what the manipulative Hugh Farey does, he's really supporting the pro-Shroud side. Let me show why. Let me bring up his paper. So here's his peer-reviewed paper, right? So let's quote this. So Hugh selectively quotes this part. The accuracy and precision of the intra-laboratory data for the control samples were outstanding, leaving no doubt as to the quality of the AMS measurement technique. Hugh ends there, like a devilish little schemer. He doesn't quote this. However, oops, Hugh, oops. However, we're just marginally, the results were marginally consistent among the 3 laboratories. Oh, so the AMS labs sucked, prompting the authors to state that, quote unquote, it is unlikely that the errors quoted by the laboratories for sample 1 fully reflect the overall scatter. Hugh left that part out because he doesn't like hearing something negative about the AMS labs. Very interesting, Hugh. Very interesting. But nonetheless, okay, let's go down. Here's the actual quote itself. Consistency of the AMS results with the existing documentation seems compelling. But, and now here's my quote, a wave of questioning is followed. Here's the part I omitted by accident, not of the AMS method. Okay, who cares? Putting that back in, that's not my point. My point is about the shroud in particular. And I wrote that in my slide, and I said that specifically to the people at Oakwood Church. No deception, no lie at all. Even if the omission was deliberate, it's not a lie. In fact, I'm going to keep this out on purpose just to teach you a lesson, Hugh, that this is not a lie, but of possible artifacts that could have affected the linen and invalidated the carbon-14 result. A sampling of the creative hypotheses put forward. The first, for example, is based on the premise that nuclear reactions involving the substantial amount of deuterium contained in the human body could produce neutrons. Neutron irradiation. That's what I taught the people at Oakwood. That's what I told them was my idea to explain the erroneous carbon-14 dating. I omitted this from my quote as well. Did I do that on purpose? Was I trying to deceive? Why would I want to deceive the people at Oakwood and withhold from them information that supports what I believe, what I want them to hear, what I would want them to know about? How come you didn't say I left these first two options out on purpose? You don't have, and he satanically omitted these details, do you, Hugh? No, because you're a liar. You manipulate things to make people and strawman them into doing things that they're not. Number one, this omission was not deliberate. It was an accident based on my copying and pasting the quotes all the way back, going back all the way to 2018 without updating or anything like that, because I've seen no need to up until now. Secondly, even if it was deliberate, so what? I'm still being honest that this part is totally irrelevant for the point that I'm using the quote to prove to the people in this slide. You lied about me, Hugh. You lied. And you... ridiculous. Gosh. Anyways, continuing on. So the neutron thing, right? Okay, and then he goes through the other proposals. Finally, the third proposal raises the question of non-contemporaneous organic matter, whether from incompletely removed carbon contamination from oil, wax, tears, and smoke that the cloth had been exposed to, or from bacterial attack. Deposit over the ages. Apart from the effects of such factors on the shroud, the issue of organic reactions and non-contemporaneous contamination of ancient materials can be a very serious and complex matter, deserving quantitative investigation of the possible impacts on measurement accuracy. So that's perfect. That's exactly what I told them. I omitted one irrelevant detail, and I omitted more details that would have been helpful for me had I included them in the quote. Things that would have supported stuff that I said later on. Why did I do that? Because I'm going by the quote that I wrote down from Ian Wilson back in 2018 when I was preparing for my debate, and it's never been pointed out to me that there's anything wrong with it, and so I continue to use it. And guess what? Even now, with your critique, Hugh, which is nitpicking to the point of stupidity and foolishness, it's satanic what you've written here. I'm not going to change. I still see no reason to change it. So long as I'm clear that Lloyd Curry is talking about the problems with the AMS dating technique with respect to dating linen textiles like the shroud, and with the shroud in particular, there's no misquote here. This is exactly a perfect quote. So I'm going to continue to use this quote as is. I don't see any lie at all in what I've said. Now, there would be a lie. I would admit this. Now that I'm aware that, and remember, right, that I've edited out this not the AMS method kind of thing. Now that I'm aware of that, consciously, if I'm ever trying to make the point that Lloyd Curry dismissed the AMS method as a whole as just wholly unreliable in general, then I would be manipulating things. But that's not what I said to the people at Oakwood. I specified up here, I even specified up here that all these quotes are serving to show that the AMS carbon dating method was unreliable with respect to dating linen textiles comparable to the Shroud. And if I have a quote specifically about the Shroud, even better, right? Obviously, the Shroud is a linen textile that's like the Shroud because it is the Shroud. So there's no lie or deception there. Further, I say, and its relation to the Shroud in particular. Seriously, what is the lie here supposed to be? I don't get it. Like, this is the one thing that I don't get, kind of thing, especially. Like I said, at least with the other thing, like, okay, 7 out of 17 and all 5 labs, these are errors. They're minor little technical errors. Now that I've seen read over the fully again, the peer-reviewed papers themselves, right? You're correct. It's 6 labs and there's at least 18 experiments. Maybe it's 7 out of 18 experiments whereby they utterly, utterly failed. Yeah, I have nothing to be ashamed about. Hugh, you are the only one who needs to be ashamed for calling me a liar on this basis. You've literally got nothing here where I'm misquoting anyone or misquoting anything. I'm quoting correctly in all cases. Every time I've quoted correctly. The only thing I will say I got erroneous in terms of a fact is here, which isn't a quote, but it's my summary of the Trondheim report about all 5 labs. But again, that's coming from Mark Antonacci. So I was quoting him properly, and Mark Antonacci wasn't quoting the peer-reviewed study properly. So that's why I got that wrong. Now that I've seen the peer-reviewed study, the primary source with my own eyes, I'll correct those facts going forward. Not a lie, not deception on my part. It looks to me like it's just an innocent mistake on Mark Antonacci's part. So you still have this problem. It's still proven to be very, very problematic and wasn't up to the task of dating the Shroud of Turin. I was right. Hugh was wrong. I hope that helps the fan who is questioning or not sure about my integrity or honesty, whether or not I had misquoted the carbon-14 scientists on this front. I have not. And like I said, unlike Hugh, I will include the entirety of these peer-reviewed papers on my blog so people can read them for themselves, just like I've now done in response to hearing Hugh's, having to respond to these straw man and lies from Hugh. Or here's a quote I didn't give from Science News. Interviewed C-14 experts. This again is a quote as I had it from 2018. I would just copy and paste this in a slide when I'm, trying to put together something, for a popular level presentation. Grave concern that the AMS technology used to date the Shroud is not yet ready for the task. Son of a gun, that's not what I want to do. That's not what I want to do either. Okay, so here it is. Okay. From Science News, several carbon-14 experts prior to the 1988 dating and the consensus of carbon-14 scientists at that time said they had a grave concern that the AMS technology used to date the Shroud is not yet ready for the task of dating the Shroud, largely because of the proven spuriousness of the readings from small samples. And there has been very little testing of linen with this new method. This comes from Mark Antonacci's first book, Resurrection of the Shroud, page 176. Right? I haven't, this is just something I put in 2018 within a week. I had a week and a half to prepare for my debate. Obviously, I wasn't reading all of the peer-reviewed papers in preparation for that debate. I just didn't have the time to. Neither did my opponent, Alan, for that matter. Furthermore, during the Science News investigations, one of the fellow carbon-14 scientists, Dr. Garmin Harbottle, inventor of one of the other new carbon-14 dating techniques, at the time said that, quote unquote, each substance has its own peculiarities. When attempting to carbon date it, he means the Shroud, and I wish linen cloth was better understood before the shroud is dated. So here's another secular carbon-14 scientist, one of the world's experts on the same level as Dr. Harry Gov, admitting we shouldn't be dating the shroud. We can't rely on AMS carbon-14 datings. It doesn't know what it's doing with linen textiles yet. It hasn't been vetted. It hasn't been tested yet. Now, okay, Science News. Again, if I were preparing a slide, I would have just copied and pasted this quote to save time and for efficiency in a popular level program. Hugh would probably say, oh, well, this is Science News article is based on this peer-reviewed paper, and Dale didn't quote that, and he's lying and stuff like that. No,